The moment Evan Brooks pushed open room 247, he had no idea he was about to meet the woman who would save his life, or that she was dying. What happens when a wrong turn leads you to exactly where you belong? When a stranger's loneliness mirrors your own so perfectly that walking away becomes impossible. This is a story about grief, hope, and the kind of love that asks for nothing but gives everything. Stay with me until the end. This journey will break your heart and put it back together. And when you finish, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Evan Brooks was late. Not fashionably late. Not the kind of late you could laugh off with an apologetic smile and a self-deprecating joke. This was the breathless, frantic kind of late. The kind where you're half jogging through hospital corridors with a bouquet of daisies wilting in your fist, checking your phone every 30 seconds, knowing that your best friend Marcus was probably sitting in his hospital bed making jokes about your terrible sense of time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. The smell of antiseptic and cafeteria food hung in the air, that particular hospital cocktail that always made Evan's stomach turn slightly. He'd spent too much time in places like this. Too many hours in waiting rooms with magazines he couldn't focus on, too many nights sleeping in chairs that seemed designed specifically to prevent actual sleep. He turned a corner, scanning the room numbers. 243, 245. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Where are you, man? They're about to take me down for the scan." "Damn it," Evan muttered, picking up his pace. The daisies were definitely looking worse for wear now, a few petals drifting to the sterile floor behind him like a breadcrumb trail marking his hurried passage. 247. Evan didn't knock. Marcus hated when people knocked, said it made him feel like he was already dead and people were being respectfully quiet around the corpse. So Evan just pushed the door open with his shoulder, already forming his apology, already preparing to laugh off his tardiness. But the laugh died in his throat. The woman in the bed wasn't Marcus. For a suspended moment, Evan stood frozen in the doorway, his brain struggling to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The woman was thin, not just hospital thin, but the kind of fragile that spoke of months of fighting, of a body slowly surrendering to something relentless. Her hair, what little remained, was wrapped in a faded blue scarf that had seen better days. Her skin had that translucent quality that comes from too much time indoors, too much time hurting. But it was her eyes that stopped Evan cold. They were open, staring at the ceiling, and in them was a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence in the room. Not sadness exactly, not despair, just emptiness. The look of someone who had stopped expecting anything to change. The room itself confirmed what those eyes suggested. No flowers on the windowsill, no cards taped to the wall, no scattered personal items that marked a space as temporarily inhabited by someone who mattered to other people. Just the standard hospital equipment, beeping and humming its mechanical symphony, and one woman alone with it all. "Oh, God," Evan said softly, taking a step back. "I'm so sorry, But he didn't finish the sentence. Something in that moment, maybe it was the way her eyes shifted to him, registering his presence with a flicker of surprise that quickly faded back into that terrible blankness, made words feel inadequate. What do you say when you've accidentally intruded on someone's private suffering? When you've stumbled into a loneliness that feels almost sacred in its completeness? The woman didn't speak. She just watched him with those hollow eyes, and Evan felt something crack open inside his chest. A recognition, maybe. A mirror held up to something he'd been trying not to look at for the past 3 years. He should leave. He knew he should leave. Marcus was waiting. He had the wrong room. This woman was a stranger. None of this was his business. But his feet didn't move. Instead, almost without conscious thought, Evan walked forward. 3 steps. 5. Until he was standing beside the small table next to her bed. The daisies in his hand suddenly felt ridiculous, cheerful yellow faces grinning stupidly in the face of all this quiet suffering. "These were supposed to be for my friend," Evan heard himself say. His voice sounded strange in the silence of the room, too loud and too uncertain. "But I think maybe you should have them instead." He set the bouquet down on the table, arranging them quickly in a small plastic water pitcher he found there. His hands were shaking slightly, though he couldn't have said why. The woman still didn't speak, but her eyes tracked his movements with a kind of careful attention that made him feel simultaneously exposed and invisible. "I hope your day gets better," Evan said, backing toward the door. It was a stupid thing to say. What did better even mean in a place like this to someone in her condition? But he couldn't just leave in silence. That felt worse somehow. The woman's lips moved, forming what might have been a thank you, though no sound came out. Or maybe she was just breathing. Evan couldn't tell. He left. The hallway felt colder after the strange warmth of that room. Evan stood outside the closed door for a moment, his heart beating too fast, trying to orient himself. What the hell had just happened? Why did he feel like he'd just stepped out of a dream and into something too bright and harsh? His phone buzzed again. Marcus. Right. He was supposed to be visiting Marcus. Room 237, it turned out. Not 247. He'd been off by 10 rooms, reading the numbers wrong in his haste. "There he is!" Marcus called out when Evan finally made it to the correct room. Marcus was sitting up in bed, looking remarkably healthy for someone who'd just had emergency gallbladder surgery. His dark skin had its usual warm glow, and his smile was as wide and genuine as ever. "I was about to send out a search party. You get lost?" "Something like that," Evan said, forcing a smile. But his mind was still in that other room, with that other patient. "Sorry, man. Traffic was brutal." "Traffic is always brutal. That's why us smart people leave early." Marcus gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Sit down before they cart me off. Tell me about the outside world. Is it still there? Did civilization collapse while I was in here?" They talked for 20 minutes before the nurses came to take Marcus for his scan. Easy conversation, the kind that comes from 15 years of friendship. Marcus was one of those rare people who could make even a hospital stay feel like a minor inconvenience rather than a crisis. His wife Sarah had just stepped out to get coffee, and their kids had been by earlier, filling the room with the kind of chaotic energy that made the sterile space feel almost alive. When Marcus was wheeled away, promising to text later, Evan found himself walking slowly back through the corridors. He told himself he was just heading to his car, taking the same route he'd come in. Nothing more than that. But his feet stopped outside room 247. The door was closed now. Through the small window, Evan could see the woman in the same position, staring at the same ceiling. The daisies sat on her table, the only spot of color in all that white and gray. "Can I help you?" Evan turned to find a nurse watching him, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the slightly weary expression of someone who'd seen too many 12-hour shifts blur together. I brought flowers to the wrong room earlier," Evan said, nodding toward the window. "Just wanted to make sure she was okay." The nurse's expression softened in a way that made Evan's stomach tighten with something like dread. "Clara," the nurse said quietly. "Her name is Clara Hale. She doesn't have any visitors?" The nurse shook her head, and in that small gesture was a world of sadness. "Not since she was admitted. 3 weeks ago tomorrow. 3 weeks. 21 days alone in this room, with nothing but machines for company and that ceiling to stare at." Evan felt something twist in his gut. "What about family?" he asked, knowing he shouldn't, knowing this wasn't his business, but unable to stop himself. "None that I know of." The nurse glanced back toward Clara's room. "Or none that's willing to come, at least. It happens more than you'd think. Cancer has a way of showing you who really loves you." Cancer. Of course it was cancer. What else reduced a human being to such fragility, such transparent frailness? "That's," Evan started, but couldn't find the words to finish. "Heartbreaking?" the nurse supplied. "Yeah, it is, but she's fighting. Tougher than she looks, our Clara." She paused, studying Evan with sudden interest. "Those daisies really brightened her room. First flowers she's gotten." The words landed in Evan's chest like stones in still water, sending ripples through something he thought had gone numb years ago. "I should go," he said abruptly. "My daughter's expecting me." The nurse nodded, but there was a knowing quality to her smile that made Evan feel seen in a way he didn't entirely like. "Take care," she said, "and maybe if you find yourself in the neighborhood again." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The drive home was supposed to clear Evan's head. That's what driving usually did. The familiar route from the hospital to his small house in the suburbs, the progression through traffic lights and neighborhoods, the gradual transition from institution to home. Normally, by the time he pulled into his driveway, whatever heaviness he'd picked up at the hospital had started to dissipate. Not today. Today, Clara Hale's hollow eyes followed him through every turn. The image of that empty room had burned itself into his mind with a clarity that felt almost cruel. No flowers until he'd left them by accident, no visitors for 3 weeks, no one choosing her day after day after day. His daughter Sophie was on the front porch when he arrived, cross-legged on the worn wooden steps with a book in her lap and her blonde hair falling in tangles around her face. At 9 years old, she had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of hazel that changed with her mood, and her mother's habit of losing herself so completely in stories that the world around her ceased to exist. "Dad!" She looked up, marking her page with one finger. "You're late. You said you'd be home by 4. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Evan locked the car and walked up the path, noting the dandelions pushing through the cracks in the concrete. He'd been meaning to do something about those for weeks. "How was school?" "Fine. Jenny Martinez brought cupcakes because it's her birthday. Red velvet." Sophie stood, brushing invisible dust from her jeans. "Did Uncle Marcus like the flowers?" Uncle Marcus. Not really her uncle, but close enough. Marcus and Sarah had been there when Sophie was born, had been there when Emma died, had been there for every moment in between. Some families you chose, and they chose you back. "Yeah," Evan said, which wasn't exactly a lie. Marcus would have liked them. "He said to tell you he'll bring you that book he promised when he gets out." They went inside together, into the house that still felt too big despite being technically too small. This place had been Emma's dream, the fixer-upper they'd bought when Sophie was 2, planning to renovate it room by room, to grow into it together. But then Emma got sick, and all those plans had evaporated like morning dew in harsh sunlight. Now it was just half finished. The kitchen remodeled, the living room still wearing wallpaper from the 1980s, the upstairs bathroom missing fixtures they'd never gotten around to installing. A house frozen mid-transformation, just like Evan's life. "What's for dinner?" Sophie asked, dropping her backpack by the door in the way he'd asked her not to do 1,000 times. "What do you want?" "Tacos." "We had tacos Tuesday." "So, tacos are good any day." Evan smiled despite himself. "Tacos it is, then." He cooked while Sophie did her homework at the kitchen table, filling the space with the comfortable sounds of domesticity. The sizzle of ground beef, the scratch of pencil on paper, the low hum of the refrigerator that needed to be replaced but kept working anyway. This was his life now. Had been for 3 years. Work, Sophie. Home. Repeat. Sometimes Marcus or Sarah would pull him out for dinner or invite them over for game night. Sometimes Sophie had sleepovers or soccer practice. But mostly, it was just the two of them, orbiting each other in this house of unfinished plans. It was enough. It had to be enough. But tonight, while Sophie chattered about her day and Evan assembled tacos with practiced efficiency, his mind kept drifting back to that hospital room, to Clara Hale, staring at the ceiling, surrounded by emptiness. 3 weeks without a visitor. How long had it been since Evan had felt truly seen by anyone outside of Sophie? How many months, years, since he'd let himself be vulnerable enough to need another person? Emma's death had taught him that love was a liability, that opening your heart just gave the universe a target to aim for. Better to keep it closed. Safer to keep moving forward alone. But safe wasn't the same as alive. "Dad, you're burning the shells." "What?" Evan blinked, looking down to find smoke rising from the pan. "Damn it!" "Language," Sophie said primly, though she was grinning. "Sorry, shoot, dang, heck." He grabbed the pan, dumping the charred shells into the trash. "New plan, soft tacos tonight." Soft tacos are better anyway. They ate together, as they did every night, sitting at the small kitchen table that wobbled slightly no matter how many times Evan tried to fix it. Sophie talked about a test she had coming up in social studies, about how Jenny Martinez's cupcakes were good, but not as good as the ones Aunt Sarah made, about a new girl at school who didn't have any friends yet. "Her name is Riley, And she sits alone at lunch, Sophie said, her voice taking on that particular tone of righteous indignation that always reminded Evan so much of Emma. Everyone's being really mean, pretending she doesn't exist. That's not okay, Evan said, though his mind immediately conjured the image of Clara Hale in that empty room. People pretending she didn't exist. Or worse, actually forgetting she did. I know, so I sat with her today. We talked about books. She's read the whole Percy Jackson series twice. That's really kind of you, Soph. It's not kind, it's just normal. Nobody should have to be alone. The words hit Evan harder than they should have. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. His 9-year-old daughter understood something he'd been trying to forget for 3 years. That loneliness wasn't noble or protective or safe. It was just lonely. After dinner, after Sophie's bath and bedtime story, and the ritual of tucking her in with the stuffed elephant she'd had since birth, Evan found himself sitting in the living room with a beer he wasn't drinking, staring at the television that wasn't on. The house was quiet. Too quiet, in the way it always was after Sophie went to sleep. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, full of all the things Evan spent his days trying not to think about. Emma had died in a hospital room not unlike Clara's. Ovarian cancer, aggressive and relentless. They'd had 9 months from diagnosis to death, 9 months of hoping and praying and bargaining with a God Evan wasn't sure he believed in anymore. 9 months of watching the woman he loved fade away by degrees, becoming more transparent, more exhausted, more distant. The worst part wasn't the death itself. It was the isolation of it. The way suffering made you untouchable, separate from the normal world. The way friends and family slowly stopped visiting because they didn't know what to say, didn't know how to sit with grief that wasn't their own. By the end, it had been mostly just Evan, sitting beside Emma's bed, holding her hand and trying to pretend he wasn't watching her slip away. He'd promised himself after she died that he would never let himself be that vulnerable again, that he would never again love something so much that its loss could destroy him. Sophie was different. Sophie was his child, non-negotiable, a love that existed outside of choice. But romantic love? Partnership? Opening his heart to another person who could leave, who could die, who could evaporate like Emma had? No. Never again. Evan picked up his phone, scrolled aimlessly through emails he'd already read. Put it down. Picked up the remote. Put it down. The beer sat warming in his hand, condensation pooling under the bottle. He should go to bed. Tomorrow was Friday, which meant an early meeting at work, which meant he needed to be up by 6 to get Sophie ready for school first. His life ran on schedules and routines now, everything carefully organized to leave no room for the chaos that grief could bring. But instead of going to bed, Evan found himself opening his phone's browser and typing in Clara Hale. He didn't know what he expected to find, maybe a Facebook page or a LinkedIn profile, or some trace of the person she'd been before cancer had reduced her to that frail figure in a hospital bed. But the search returned nothing useful. A few Clara Hales in other states, an obituary for a Clara Hale who died in 1995, a real estate agent in Montana. No trace of his Clara Hale. His Clara Hale. When had he started thinking of her that way? Evan closed the browser, disgusted with himself. This was ridiculous. He'd walked into the wrong room, left some flowers, and that was the end of it. She was a stranger. Her suffering wasn't his responsibility. He had his own life, his own problems, his own carefully maintained emotional distance to protect. But as he finally went to bed, climbing between cold sheets in a room that still felt too empty even after 3 years, Evan couldn't shake the memory of those hollow eyes. That terrible aloneness. Nobody should have to be alone. Sophie's words echoed in his head as he stared at the ceiling. The same ceiling Clara was probably staring at right now, in a room 10 miles away, with no one thinking about her except a stranger who'd stumbled into her isolation by accident. 3 weeks without a visitor. Evan rolled over, punched his pillow, tried to force himself to sleep. But his mind wouldn't quiet. Kept circling back to that room, to that loneliness, to the way Clara's eyes had tracked his movement when he'd set down the daisies. That flicker of something, surprise maybe, or hope, before it faded back into emptiness. What if no one ever came for her? What if she fought her way through cancer only to emerge into a life where no one had noticed she'd been gone? What if she died in that room, alone, and Evan had been her last chance to know that someone, anyone, saw her. The thought was unbearable. It was also not his problem, not his responsibility, not his anything. Evan closed his eyes, and against the darkness of his eyelids he saw Emma. Not Emma, as she'd been at the end, frail and fading, but Emma from before. Emma laughing at one of his terrible jokes. Emma dancing in their kitchen while dinner burned on the stove. Emma holding newborn Sophie and crying happy tears. Emma, who used to volunteer at a homeless shelter every Thursday. Emma, who never passed a struggling musician without putting money in their case. Emma, who believed that small acts of kindness mattered, that showing up for strangers was how you stayed human. Emma, who would have walked back into that room without hesitation. "Damn it," Evan whispered into the darkness. He knew what he was going to do, had probably known from the moment he'd set those daisies down, but admitting it felt like opening a door he'd worked very hard to keep closed. It felt dangerous. It felt like choosing vulnerability over safety, like putting his heart in harm's way again. It felt terrifying. It also felt necessary. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he would go back. Not to visit, exactly, just to check. To make sure she was okay. To maybe bring something else, a book, perhaps, or a magazine. Something to break up the monotony of staring at that ceiling. One time. Just once more. Then he'd let it go. Even as he made the promise to himself, Evan knew it was a lie. Knew that the moment he'd walked into room 247, something had shifted. The careful walls he had built around his heart had developed a crack. And through that crack, Clara Hale's loneliness had slipped in and wrapped itself around his own. He finally fell asleep sometime after midnight, his last conscious thought a question. When had protecting himself from pain become the same thing as forgetting how to live? Friday morning arrived with autumn rain, the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything gray and slick. Evan got Sophie ready for school, packed her lunch, drove her through traffic that was somehow worse in the rain, and kissed her forehead before she ran into the building with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too, Soph. Have a good day." Then he sat in the school parking lot, engine running, windshield wipers beating their rhythmic pattern, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and insane. He was going back to the hospital. The reasonable part of his brain offered a dozen objections. He had to get to work. He barely knew this woman. This wasn't his responsibility. He was opening himself up to hurt. He should let it go. But another part, quieter but more insistent, whispered that walking away from Clara Hale would be walking away from something in himself, some essential piece of humanity he'd been trying to bury alongside Emma. Evan put the car in drive and headed toward the hospital. The route was familiar now, though usually he only took it to visit Marcus or, in darker days, to sit in the parking lot and remember Emma. The building rose against the gray sky like a monument to suffering and hope intertwined, both the place where people fought to stay alive and the place where they sometimes lost the fight. He parked in the visitor lot, killed the engine, and sat for a long moment, listening to the rain on the roof. What was he doing? What did he think would happen? He'd walk into Clara's room and, what? Introduce himself? Ask about her cancer? Offer to be her friend? All of it sounded ridiculous. All of it sounded presumptuous. But leaving sounded worse. Evan grabbed the book he'd impulsively bought at a drugstore on the way, a collection of Mary Oliver poems, because he'd seen it and thought of Sophie's comment about nobody deserving to be alone, and Mary Oliver had written beautifully about connection and nature and the small moments that make life worth living. If this was a mistake, at least it was a well-intentioned one. The hospital lobby was busy with the morning rush, visitors arriving, patients checking in, doctors and nurses moving with purposeful efficiency. Evan signed in at the desk, got his visitor badge, and made his way to the elevator. His heart was beating too fast, his palms slightly sweaty. This was absurd. He was a grown man, nervous about visiting a sick woman he didn't know. But he didn't turn back. Third floor. Room 247. The door was closed again. Through the window, Evan could see Clara in the same position as yesterday, though the daisies had been moved closer to her bed. Someone, probably that kind nurse, had put them where Clara could see them. Evan raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she didn't want visitors? What if his presence yesterday had been an intrusion she'd tolerated out of politeness or shock? What if she looked at him and saw what he was? A broken widower playing at heroism, trying to fix his own pain by focusing on someone else's. Before he could spiral further into doubt, the door opened from the inside. The nurse from yesterday stood there, her expression shifting from surprise to something like satisfaction. "I had a feeling you might come back," she said quietly. "She's awake. Having a tough morning, but awake." "I just thought I brought a book." Evan held it up like evidence of his innocence. "I didn't mean to intrude. If this is a bad time, honey, any time someone shows up for that woman is a good time." The nurse, her name tag read Sandra, stepped aside. 10 minutes, okay? She tires easily." Before Evan could respond, Sandra had disappeared down the hallway, leaving him standing in the doorway of Clara Hale's room with a book of poetry and absolutely no idea what to say. Clara's eyes turned toward him, and for a moment there was no recognition, just that same careful blankness, that protective emptiness. Then something shifted, a slight widening of her eyes, a catch in her breath that the oxygen cannula couldn't quite hide. "You," she said, and her voice was rough, like she hadn't used it in days. Maybe she hadn't. Who was there to talk to? "Me?" Evan agreed, feeling foolish and exposed and committed. I realized yesterday that I never properly introduced myself. I'm Evan Brooks. You brought the flowers." It wasn't a question. "By accident, actually. I had the wrong room." He stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. The room felt smaller than yesterday, more intimate. Or maybe that was just because Clara was looking at him now, really seeing him. "But I'm glad I left them. They seem to be holding up okay." The ghost of a smile touched Clara's lips. "They're the first flowers I've gotten in." She trailed off, and Evan could see her doing the mental math, counting back through months or maybe years. A long time. The sadness in those words was overwhelming. Evan found himself moving closer to her bed, pulled by something he couldn't name. "I thought you might like something to read," he said, holding out the book. "Mary Oliver. She writes about nature and beauty and paying attention to small things. I don't know if that's your kind of thing, but..." Clara took the book with hands that shook slightly. Her fingers were thin, delicate, the IV taped to the back of one hand making her look even more fragile. She turned the book over, studying the cover, a close-up photograph of a butterfly on a flower. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" She read from the back cover, her voice barely above a whisper. When she looked up at Evan, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question hit Evan like a punch to the chest. Why was he? He barely knew this woman. Her suffering wasn't his responsibility. He had his own grief, his own carefully maintained distance from the world's pain. But standing there, looking into Clara Hale's eyes, eyes that were hollow but also somehow desperately, achingly hopeful, Evan understood. Because nobody should have to face this alone, he heard himself say. Sophie's words, coming out of his mouth. Emma's philosophy. Living on through him despite his best efforts to bury it. A tear slipped down Clara's cheek, and she didn't wipe it away. She just held the book to her chest like it was precious, like it was a lifeline, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But he did. That was the strange thing. Somehow in the space of 2 accidental visits, Evan understood exactly what it meant, because he'd been in his own version of that empty room for 3 years, surrounded by people who loved him but fundamentally alone with his grief, his fear, his carefully guarded heart. "Can I come back?" The words were out before Evan could stop them. "To visit, I mean, if you're okay with that." Clara looked at him for a long moment, and Evan could see her weighing the offer, weighing whether to accept kindness from a stranger, whether to let hope in, whether to risk being disappointed when he inevitably stopped coming. "I'd like that," she finally said. "Very much." And there it was, the commitment made. The door opened, the crack in Evan's carefully constructed walls widening just a little bit more. He stayed for exactly 10 minutes, as Sandra had instructed. They didn't talk about cancer or death or loneliness. Instead, they talked about small things, Clara's favorite poem in the book, Wild Geese, which Evan promised to read that night. His daughter Sophie and her love of reading, the rain outside that was turning the world gray and soft. When Sandra appeared in the doorway, tapping her watch, Evan stood reluctantly. "I'll come back," he said. "Maybe tomorrow, if that's okay?" "Saturdays are slow," Clara said. "That would be nice." Nice. Such a small word for what this was, what it might become. But Evan didn't have bigger words yet. Didn't know if he'd ever have bigger words again. So he settled for nice, and for the small smile that crossed Clara's face when he promised to return. Walking out of that room, Evan felt like he'd just done something monumentally stupid and impossibly right at the same time. He'd committed to visiting a dying woman he barely knew, had opened himself up to witnessing her suffering, had volunteered to care about someone new when caring still felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. But when he got to his car and sat in the driver's seat, staring through the rain-streaked windshield at the hospital's gray walls, Evan realized he felt more alive than he had in 3 years. Terrified, yes. Uncertain, absolutely. But alive. And maybe, he thought as he started the engine and headed toward work, maybe that was enough. Maybe choosing to show up, to see another person, to let himself be seen in return. Maybe that was how you learned to live again after grief had taught you only how to survive. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Riley sat with me again at lunch. We're friends now." Evan smiled, typing back, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Proud of you. Nobody should have to be alone." His daughter understood it. Clara Hale needed it. And Evan was slowly, terrifyingly beginning to remember it. The wrong door, he thought as he merged into traffic, rain drumming on the roof, the day stretching ahead of him. He'd walked through the wrong door and found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. Now he just had to be brave enough not to walk back out. Evan kept his promise. Saturday morning found him back in the hospital parking lot, this time with Sophie in tow. She'd asked where they were going at breakfast, and Evan had hesitated, trying to find words that wouldn't make this seem strange or heavy or complicated. Finally, he'd settled on the simplest truth he could manage. "There's someone I want you to meet, someone who could use a friend." Sophie had looked at him with those hazel eyes that missed nothing, that same measuring gaze Emma used to give him when she knew he wasn't telling her the whole story. But all she'd said was, "Okay, Dad, can I bring my book?" Now they walked through the hospital corridors together, Sophie's small hand in his, and Evan felt his heart beating too fast again. What was he doing bringing his daughter to meet a dying woman? What if Clara had a bad day? What if seeing Sophie made Clara sad, reminded her of everything she might never have? What if this whole thing was a terrible mistake that would hurt everyone involved? But it was too late to turn back. They were already at room 247, and Sophie was already knocking with the confident rap of someone who'd never learned to be afraid of sickness or death or the rawness of other people's pain. "Come in," Clara's voice called, stronger than yesterday, and when Evan pushed open the door, he found her sitting up slightly, the Mary Oliver book open on her lap. Her eyes went wide when she saw Sophie. "Hi," Sophie said, walking forward with the easy confidence of childhood. "I'm Sophie. Are you the friend my dad was talking about?" For a moment, Clara just stared, and Evan saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, pleasure, and a deep, aching sadness all at once. Then she smiled, and it transformed her whole face, chasing away some of the hollowness and bringing a warmth that made her look almost healthy. "I suppose I am," Clara said softly. "Your dad told me about you. He said you loved to read. I love it so much. I'm reading Percy Jackson right now. It's about Greek gods, but in modern times." Sophie pulled up a chair without being asked, settling in like she'd been visiting hospital patients her whole life. "What are you reading?" Clara held up the Mary Oliver book. "Poetry. Your father brought it for me." "Poetry is okay. I prefer stories with more action, but my mom used to read poetry sometimes." Sophie said it casually, the way she said most things about Emma now, acknowledging her existence without dwelling in the sadness. 3 years had given her a child's resilient grief, the kind that made room for both remembering and living. Evan watched Clara's expression shift, understanding dawning in her eyes. She looked at him, a question forming, but he just gave a small nod. Yes, his daughter knew about loss. Yes, they'd both survived it. Yes, that was part of why he understood the emptiness of her room. Your mother had good taste, Clara said gently. She had the best taste. Dad says I got her eyes. Sophie leaned forward, suddenly curious. Why are you in the hospital? Are you very sick? Sophie, Evan said, but Clara held up a hand. It's okay. I appreciate honesty. She looked at Sophie with serious attention, treating her like an equal rather than a child. Yes, I'm very sick. I have cancer. Do you know what that is? Kind of. It's when cells in your body go bad and make you tired and hurt. My friend Jackson's grandma had it. That's right. I'm fighting it, but it's a hard fight. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Fighting is hard, but my dad says the hardest things are usually the most important things. Are you winning? His question hung in the air, blunt and impossible and somehow exactly right. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I'm trying. Good. Trying is what matters. Sophie settled back in her chair, apparently satisfied with this answer. Do you want to hear about Percy Jackson? I could tell you the story so far. It's really good. And just like that, the tension in the room dissolved. For the next 20 minutes, Sophie narrated the adventures of Percy Jackson with the enthusiasm of someone sharing the most important information in the world. Clara listened with rapt attention, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, treating Sophie's story with the seriousness it deserved. Evan sat quietly, watching this unlikely friendship form, and felt something in his chest loosen. This was what he'd forgotten in 3 years of grief, how simple human connection could be, how easy it was to show up and care, how much healing happened in the space between strangers becoming something more. When Sandra appeared to check Clara's vitals, Sophie barely paused, continuing her story while Clara got her blood pressure taken and her IV adjusted. The nurse caught Evan's eye and smiled, a warm, knowing expression that said she understood what was happening here, how important this was. You have a wonderful family, Clara said after Sandra left, and there was such longing in her voice that Evan felt it like a physical ache. We're pretty okay, Sophie agreed. You could be part of it if you want. We're always looking for more people. Right, Dad? The question landed on Evan like a weight and a gift at the same time. He looked at his daughter, then at Clara, and saw the hope and fear warring in her eyes. Saw her wanting to believe that this could be real, that these strangers could become something permanent, but being afraid to trust it. Right, Evan said, his voice rougher than he intended. We absolutely are. Clara pressed her lips together, fighting tears. That's very kind of you both. The kindest thing anyone's offered me in a long time. It's not kind, Sophie said, echoing what she'd told Evan about the new girl at school. It's just normal. Nobody should be alone. There were those words again, coming from his 9-year-old daughter with the certainty of absolute truth. Evan met Clara's gaze over Sophie's head, and in that moment, something shifted between them. An acknowledgement, an agreement. Whatever this was, friendship, family, fellowship, and suffering, they were in it now, together. They stayed for another hour, until Clara's exhaustion became too obvious to ignore. She tried to hide it, but Evan could see the way her eyelids were growing heavy, the way her responses were coming slower. He stood, gently touching Sophie's shoulder. We should let you rest, he said. Will you come back? Clara asked, and there was no hiding the vulnerability in the question. Tomorrow, Evan promised, if that's okay. Every day is okay, Clara said quietly. Every day would be a gift. In the car, driving home through the bright autumn afternoon, Sophie was uncharacteristically quiet. Evan glanced at her in the rearview mirror, saw her staring out the window with that thoughtful expression she got when she was processing something big. What are you thinking about, Soph? Clara seems really lonely, Sophie said. Like the kind of lonely that makes you tired inside. Evan's throat tightened. Yeah, she does. We should keep visiting her, not just tomorrow, for a long time. I was planning to. Good. Sophie was quiet for another moment. Dad, is Clara going to die? The question was so direct, so fearless, that Evan almost swerved. He steadied the car, his hands gripping the wheel too tight, trying to find an answer that was honest but not terrifying. "I don't know," he finally said. "She's very sick. Sometimes people get better, and sometimes they don't. Like Mom. Like Mom." Sophie nodded, accepting this. "Then we should make sure she's not alone while we can. That's what Mom would do." Yes, Evan thought, his eyes stinging. That's exactly what Emma would do. His daughter carried her mother's compassion like a torch, lighting up the dark corners where people suffered alone. "You're a good person, Sophie Brooks," he said. "I know," she replied with the unself-conscious confidence of childhood. "I learned from the best." That night, after Sophie was in bed, Evan sat in the darkened living room with his laptop open, finally letting himself do what he'd resisted since Thursday. He Googled cancer statistics, survival rates, treatment options. He read articles about the isolation of serious illness, about how patients often lost their support systems exactly when they needed them most. He learned about caregiver fatigue, about the strange mathematics of suffering where the sicker you got, the lonelier you became. He learned that Clara was fighting odds that weren't in her favor, and that even if she won this battle, there would be others. Cancer was rarely a single fight. It was a war that could last years, that could take everything you had and still ask for more. He should stop this now, the reasonable part of his brain whispered, before he got too invested, before caring about Clara became another way to experience loss, before he opened himself up to grief all over again. But he was already too invested. The moment Sophie had sat in that chair and offered Clara a place in their small family, the decision had been made. They were in this now, for better or worse, for whatever time Clara had left. Evan closed the laptop and pulled out his phone instead. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Marcus, then typed out a text before he could second-guess himself. "Remember how I went to the wrong room at the hospital? That woman, Clara, she doesn't have anyone. No family, no visitors. I've been going back. Brought Sophie today. I know this is probably crazy, but I can't stop thinking about her being alone." The response came almost immediately. "Marcus never slept before midnight. Not crazy. Human. Emma would be proud of you, man. I'm scared I'm going to mess this up. Get too attached. Make it worse somehow. You're already attached, and I've never known you to make anything worse by caring too much. That's always been your superpower, brother. You love hard." Evan stared at the words, feeling them land somewhere deep in his chest. He'd spent 3 years trying not to love hard, trying to protect himself by keeping everything at arm's length. But here he was, caring about a stranger who might die, letting his daughter build a friendship with someone who might disappear. What if she doesn't make it? Then you'll have given her something beautiful before she goes. And isn't that worth it? Evan didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Marcus knew him well enough to know the silence meant yes. Sunday morning, Evan went to the hospital alone. Sophie had a soccer game, and Sarah had offered to take her so Evan could visit Clara without worrying about his daughter. He'd protested initially, but Sarah had just given him that knowing look that said she understood what was happening, what this was becoming. "Take your time," she'd said. "We've got Sophie. You go be there for your friend." Your friend. Such simple words for something that felt increasingly complicated. He found Clara awake and alone, as always, but there was something different about her today. A tension in her shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of pain beyond the physical. "Bad day?" Evan asked, setting down the coffee he'd brought her, decaf with cream, the way she'd mentioned preferring during yesterday's visit. "Test results came back," Clara said, her voice flat. "The tumors aren't responding to the treatment as well as they'd hoped. Doctor wants to try a more aggressive approach." Evan felt his stomach drop. "What does that mean?" "It means more chemo, stronger doses, more side effects, more time in this room." She gestured around the sterile space with something close to despair. "More time alone." "You're not alone," Evan said, pulling the chair close to her bed. "Not anymore." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression was so raw it was almost painful to witness. "Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything. You stumbled into the wrong room and now you're—" "What? Playing savior? Trying to assuage your guilt about something? Making yourself feel better?" The words were harsh, defensive, and Evan understood they came from a place of deep hurt and deeper fear. Clara was protecting herself the only way she knew how, by pushing away kindness before it could be taken back. "I'm doing this because I know what it's like to be alone in a room full of people," Evan said quietly. "Because when my wife died, everyone meant well, but nobody really knew how to stay. They brought casseroles for a week and then slowly disappeared back into their own lives. And I was left in a house that felt too big, raising a daughter who needed me to be okay when I was falling apart. I know loneliness, Clara. I know what it does to you, and I'm not going to let you drown in it if I can help." Silence fell between them, heavy with truth. Clara's eyes were shining with tears she wouldn't let fall, her jaw tight with the effort of holding herself together. "I'm so tired," she whispered finally. "So tired of fighting, so tired of hurting, so tired of waiting for someone to remember I exist." "Then stop waiting," Evan said. "I'm here. Sophie's here. We're not going anywhere." "You say that now, but when it gets hard—" "It's already hard," Evan interrupted. "You think I don't know what I'm signing up for? I watched my wife die from cancer. I know exactly how ugly this can get, how much it asks of everyone involved. I'm not here because I think this will be easy. I'm here because some things are worth doing even when they're hard." Clara finally let the tears fall, and they streamed down her face unchecked. Evan reached out, taking her hand in his, and felt how fragile it was, how easily it could break. But he held it anyway, held it firmly but gently, trying to communicate through touch what words couldn't quite convey. They sat like that for a long time, Clara crying silently and Evan bearing witness to her grief. And somehow the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of acknowledgement, full of companionship, full of the strange comfort that comes from not being alone in your suffering. When Clara finally spoke again, her voice was steadier. "I don't have anyone else. My parents died when I was young. I was an only child. I had a partner once, but when I got diagnosed, he couldn't handle it. Just left. Most of my friends drifted away after that. I guess I made it easy for them, pulling back, not asking for help. And now here I am." "Here you are," Evan agreed. "But not alone anymore. I don't understand why you care. Because Sophie's right. Nobody should have to face this alone, and because—" He paused, trying to find the right words. "Because caring about you makes me remember how to be human again. These past 3 years, I've been going through the motions. Work, Sophie, home, repeat. I've been alive, but not really living, and somehow sitting here with you, showing up for you. It's teaching me that it's possible to open your heart again without it destroying you." Clara squeezed his hand, the pressure weak but intentional. "I'm terrified of hoping," she admitted, "of believing this is real and then having it taken away." "Hope is always terrifying," Evan said. "That's what makes it brave." Over the next week, visiting Clara became part of Evan's routine. He'd drop Sophie at school, go to work, and then spend his lunch hour at the hospital. Sometimes he'd bring food, soup from the deli Clara mentioned liking, fresh fruit, anything to break up the monotony of hospital meals. Sometimes he'd bring books or magazines or downloaded movies on his tablet. Sometimes he'd just sit and talk, or sit in comfortable silence while Clara dozed and he caught up on work emails. He started to learn the rhythms of her days, the patterns of her illness. Mornings were usually better when the pain medication was fresh and her energy hadn't been depleted yet. Afternoons were harder, exhaustion pulling at her, making even conversation feel like a marathon. Evenings brought pain that the nurses fought with carefully measured doses, a delicate balance between relief and over-sedation. He met her doctors, learned the names of her nurses, memorized which shifts brought which personalities. Sandra became a friend, updating him on Clara's condition when he called, texting him on bad days so he could be prepared for what he'd find. And slowly, gradually, Clara's room began to change. The daisies were joined by other flowers, roses from Sophie's garden, sunflowers from the farmer's market, wildflowers Evan picked on a whim during a weekend hike. Books accumulated on the bedside table, a small library of options for whatever mood struck her. A soft throw blanket in shades of blue replaced the thin hospital one. Photos appeared on the windowsill, Sophie at her soccer game, Evan and Sophie hiking last summer, candid shots of Clara smiling during their visits. The room started to look lived in, cared for, loved. But Evan was careful not to let Clara know the full extent of what he was doing. He asked the nurses to place the items when Clara was sleeping or down for tests, maintaining the fiction that these were small gestures rather than the systematic campaign to make her feel less forgotten than it actually was. He told himself he was protecting her, not wanting her to feel obligated or overwhelmed by his attention. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was protecting himself too. If he acknowledged how much he was investing in this, how deeply he was starting to care, it would make the potential loss even more terrifying. Marcus noticed, of course. "You're at that hospital more than you're at work," he said one evening when Evan stopped by after leaving Clara's room. Marcus was home now, recovering well, and his living room had become Evan's confessional. "Not that I'm judging, but Sarah and I are wondering, is this still about Clara, or is this about something else?" "What else would it be about?" Evan asked, though he knew exactly what Marcus was implying. "You tell me, brother. You're the one spending every free hour with a woman you barely know, bringing her flowers, making her room feel like home. That starts to look like something beyond friendly concern." Evan shook his head firmly. "It's not like that. She's sick, Marcus, dying probably. I'm just trying to help." "Helping looks different from caring, and caring looks different from what you're doing." Marcus leaned forward, his expression gentle but serious. "And before you get defensive, I'm not saying any of this is wrong. I'm just saying maybe you should be honest with yourself about what's happening here." "Nothing's happening. I'm visiting a friend who needs support." "Evan, man, I love you, but you're full of it." Marcus sighed. "When Emma died, you shut down. I watched you build these walls around yourself, promising you'd never let anyone close enough to hurt you again. And now here you are, voluntarily walking into a situation that could absolutely destroy you. You think I don't see what that means? It means I'm trying to be a decent human being." "It means you're healing," Marcus said quietly, "whether you want to admit it or not. Clara's healing you while you're trying to help her." Evan wanted to argue, to insist that Marcus had it all wrong, that this was purely altruistic and uncomplicated. But sitting there in his best friend's living room, he couldn't quite form the words. Because maybe Marcus was right. Maybe every hour spent at Clara's bedside, every moment of connection, every small act of kindness, maybe all of it was slowly thawing the frozen parts of his heart he'd thought were gone forever. "I don't know what I'm doing," Evan admitted. "I just know I can't walk away." "Then don't," Marcus said simply. "Just be careful with your heart. And hers." On Thursday morning, 2 weeks after their first meeting, Evan arrived at the hospital to find Clara's room empty. Panic surged through him, cold and sharp. The bed was stripped, the equipment silent. All the small touches he'd added over the past weeks, the flowers, the books, the photos, were gone. "Sandra!" He caught the nurse in the hallway, his voice too loud, too desperate. "Where's Clara? What happened?" Sandra's face softened with understanding. "She's okay. They moved her to a different floor for the new treatment protocol. Room 412. I tried to call you, but..." Evan didn't wait for her to finish. He was already moving toward the elevator, his heart pounding. "4th floor, room 412. She was okay, she was alive. But the spike of fear he'd felt seeing that empty room had revealed something he'd been trying to deny. He was in love with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere between the wrong door and 2 weeks of daily visits, between Clara's hollow eyes filling with hope, and Sophie declaring her part of their family, Evan had fallen completely, terrifyingly in love with Clara Hale. He found her room and pushed inside without knocking, needing to see her, to confirm she was real and breathing and still here. Clara looked up from her bed, this one near a window with an actual view of trees, and her face transformed with a smile that made his chest ache. "Evan?" she said, and his name in her mouth sounded like home. "I'm sorry. I asked them to let you know about the move, but everything happened so fast." "You're okay," he said, crossing to her bedside. "You're okay. I'm okay," she confirmed, and then seemed to really see him, to notice the fear he hadn't quite managed to hide. "Were you worried?" "I saw the empty room and I thought..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say out loud that for one terrible moment he'd thought she was gone. Clara reached out, taking his hand in both of hers. Her grip was stronger than it had been that first day, but still so fragile. "I'm not going anywhere yet," she said softly. "Still fighting." "Good. Evan managed. That's good. They stayed like that, hands clasped, and Evan felt the truth settling over him like a blanket. He was in love with a woman who might die, who probably would die if the statistics and the doctors and the progression of her disease had anything to say about it. He had walked through the wrong door and found the exact person who could break his heart all over again, and he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Evan? Claire's voice pulled him back. Are you sure you're okay? No, he wanted to say. I'm falling in love with you, and it's terrifying and wonderful, and I don't know how to do this without losing myself again. But what he said was, yeah, I'm good. Just glad you're still here. Clara studied his face with those eyes that seemed to see straight through him, but all she said was, me too. That evening, Evan sat Sophie down after dinner and had a conversation he'd been putting off. Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about Clara. Sophie looked up from her homework, instantly alert. Is she okay? She's okay for now, but I want to make sure you understand what's happening. Clara is very sick, and even though she's fighting hard, there's a chance she might not get better. I know that, Dad. We talked about it, remember? I know we did. But I want to make sure you're really okay with us spending so much time with her. If it's too hard, if it reminds you too much of Mom, it doesn't remind me of Mom, Sophie interrupted. I mean, it does a little, but not in a bad way. It reminds me that Mom would want us to help people, and Clara makes you happy. I haven't seen you this happy in a long time. The observation, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, left Evan momentarily speechless. She makes me happy too, Sophie continued. She listens when I talk about my books, and she asks real questions, and she doesn't treat me like a little kid. Plus, she needs us. That matters, doesn't it? It matters, Evan agreed, his throat tight. Then we should keep visiting her, for as long as we can. Sophie returned to her homework, as if she had just solved a simple math problem, rather than articulated the exact thing Evan needed to hear. For as long as we can, not forever, not with promises of happy endings, just for as long as they had, whatever time that turned out to be. The new treatment protocol was brutal. Evan watched Clara endure it with a courage that left him in awe and broke his heart simultaneously. The side effects were worse than before. Nausea that left her unable to eat, fatigue that made lifting her head an achievement, pain that no amount of medication seemed to fully touch. But through it all, she never asked them to stop coming, never suggested that maybe this was too much, too hard, too sad for him and Sophie to witness. Instead, she let them in. Let them see her at her worst. Let Sophie read to her when she was too tired to hold a book herself. Let Evan sit in silence during the really bad hours, his presence the only comfort he could offer. And slowly, something neither of them had planned or expected began to take root in that hospital room. Not just friendship, not just compassion, but something deeper, more complicated, more terrifying. 3 weeks into the new treatment, Clara asked the question Evan had been both hoping for and dreading. Why are you really doing this? She said one afternoon when Sophie was at school and the room was quiet except for the beep of monitors. And don't give me the line about nobody deserving to be alone. I want the truth. Evan looked at her, really looked at her, seeing both the ravages of illness and the strength beneath it, the fear in her eyes and the hope she was trying so hard not to feel. Because you matter, he said simply. Because somewhere between the wrong door and right now, you became important to me. Because I think about you when I'm not here. Because Sophie asks about you every day. Because this room feels more like home than my actual house sometimes. Claire's breath caught. Evan, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly. I'm not expecting anything. I just need you to know that you're not a charity case or a project or a way for me to feel better about myself. You're a person I care about, a person who matters. Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks, and this time they looked different. Not sad exactly, but overwhelmed, grateful, maybe even happy. You matter to me too, she whispered, more than I should probably let you, considering everything. But I can't help it. You and Sophie. You've given me something to fight for beyond just surviving. You've given me a reason to want to wake up tomorrow. The weight of those words settled between them, changing something fundamental. This wasn't just kindness anymore. This wasn't just showing up for someone in need. This was caring on a level that made both of them vulnerable, that opened them both up to devastating loss. It was also, Evan realized, completely worth it. He leaned forward, taking Clara's hand. Then keep fighting, he said. Keep waking up. Keep letting us be here. Okay? Okay, Clara agreed, and her smile was the most beautiful thing Evan had seen since Emma's last real smile 3 years ago. Outside Clara's window, the autumn leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, life burning bright before the long winter. And inside that room, two broken people were slowly, carefully, building something new from the pieces of their separate griefs. Neither of them knew if Clara would survive long enough to see what they might become. But for the first time in years, both of them were brave enough to hope. The hope they'd found together became both a lifeline and a fragile thing, tested daily by the relentless progression of Clara's treatment. November arrived with early frost and shorter days, and with it came a shift in Clara's condition that Evan felt in his bones before anyone said the words out loud. She was getting worse. It started small. Clara sleeping through more of his visits, her responses coming slower, the spaces between their conversations growing longer as exhaustion claimed her more frequently. The nurses adjusted medication schedules, brought in additional monitoring equipment, spoke in the careful tones that healthcare workers used when they were preparing you for bad news without actually delivering it yet. Evan found himself staying later each evening, reluctant to leave her alone in the dark. He'd sit in the chair beside her bed long after visiting hours technically ended, watching the rise and fall of her chest, counting breaths like prayers. Sandra had stopped enforcing the rules weeks ago, recognizing something in Evan's vigil that transcended policy. Sometimes she'd bring him coffee and a sad smile that said she understood what was happening, what he stood to lose. On a Wednesday evening in mid-November, Evan was reading aloud from a novel Clara had requested when she suddenly reached out and grabbed his hand with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide, frightened in a way he'd never seen before. "Evan, I need to tell you something." He set the book aside immediately, leaning forward. "What is it? Are you in pain? Should I get Sandra?" "No, not that. Just listen." Clara's grip tightened, her thin fingers digging into his palm. "If something happens to me, if I don't make it through this—" "Don't talk like that," Evan interrupted, but Clara shook her head firmly. "We have to talk like that. We have to be honest." Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. "If I don't make it, I need you to know that these past weeks with you and Sophie have been the happiest of my life. Even here, even like this. You gave me something I'd stopped believing in." "Clara, but let me finish." She drew a shaky breath. I spent so long being alone that I convinced myself it was what I deserved. That maybe I was the kind of person who was meant to go through life solo. And then you walked through that door by mistake, and everything changed. You saw me. Not just the cancer, not just the dying woman in a hospital bed. You saw me, Evan, the real me. Tears were streaming down Evan's face now, hot and unchecked. "You're not going anywhere," he said, but even he could hear the desperation in his own voice. "The treatment is working. The doctor said it was a possibility, not a promise." Claire's thumb traced circles on the back of his hand, a gesture so tender it made his heart ache. "I need to say this while I can. I need you to know that I'm in love with you. Completely, impossibly in love with you. And I know the timing is terrible and the circumstances are even worse, but I can't leave this world without telling you the truth." The words hung between them, beautiful and terrible and devastating all at once. Evan had known, on some level, that his feelings for Clara had deepened into something that looked a lot like love. But hearing her say it first, hearing the certainty in her voice despite everything, broke something open inside him. "I love you too," he said, the words coming out rough and raw. "I tried not to. I tried to keep it just friendly, just supportive. But Clara, I am so completely in love with you it terrifies me. The thought of losing you—" "I know," she whispered. "I know because I feel the same way about leaving you, about leaving Sophie. You've both become my family, the family I thought I'd never have, and the idea of not being here to see what we could become." Her voice broke, and suddenly they were both crying, holding on to each other in that hospital room like they could keep the inevitable at bay through sheer force of will. "I'm not ready to let you go," Evan said into her hair, breathing in the antiseptic smell that had replaced whatever perfume she used to wear. "I just found you. We just found each other. Then don't let me go, Clara said. Not yet. Stay with me. Fight with me. For however long we have. Always, Evan promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. For as long as you'll let me. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, crying and holding on, and somewhere in that embrace a decision was made. They would stop pretending this was temporary, stop protecting themselves from the inevitable hurt. They would love each other fully, completely, for whatever time remained, and deal with the consequences when they came. When Evan finally left the hospital that night, well past midnight, he felt hollowed out and filled up at the same time. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and empty roads, his mind replaying Clara's words over and over. She loved him. She was in love with him, and he loved her back with a fierceness that should have been impossible for someone he'd known less than 2 months. Sophie was asleep when he got home, staying overnight with Marcus and Sarah, as she often did on weeknights now. The house was dark and silent, and Evan found himself standing in the living room, staring at the photographs on the mantel. Emma smiled out from a dozen frames, frozen in moments of joy that felt both close and impossibly distant. "I need your permission," he said out loud to her image, feeling foolish but needing to do it anyway. "I need you to tell me it's okay to love someone else, to let myself be happy again, even if it's only for a little while." The silence that answered felt heavy with meaning, though Evan knew that was probably just his exhausted brain projecting what he wanted to hear. But standing there in the dark, looking at his late wife's face, he felt something shift. A release, maybe. A letting go of the guilt he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Emma would have loved Clara, he realized. Would have been the first person pushing him toward her, telling him that life was too short to waste on fear. Emma had never believed in hoarding love, never thought that caring for someone new diminished what they'd shared. She would have wanted him to open his heart again. More than that, she would have wanted Sophie to have more people who loved her, more family to surround her, more examples of what it meant to show up for others even when it was hard. The next morning, Evan sat Sophie down before school and told her the truth. Not all of it. Not the parts about being in love and terrified and desperately hoping for more time. But enough. "Clara's getting sicker," he said gently. "The doctors are doing everything they can, but her body isn't responding the way they hoped. The next few weeks are going to be really important." Sophie's face crumpled slightly, but she held herself together with the strength of someone who'd already learned that crying didn't stop bad things from happening. "Is she going to die?" she asked, and the directness of the question reminded Evan so much of Clara that his chest tightened. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. The doctors don't know yet." "Can we see her today, after school?" "Of course. But Sophie, I need you to understand that she might not be awake much. She might not be able to talk or play games or listen to your stories. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded, her jaw set with determination. "It doesn't matter if she can talk. It just matters that we're there. That's what you always say, right? Showing up is what counts." Evan pulled his daughter into a hug, overwhelmed by her wisdom and her courage. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "You're just noticing more now." That afternoon, they went to the hospital together. Clara was awake, but barely, her eyes half open, her breathing labored in a way that made Evan's stomach drop. But when she saw Sophie, she managed a small smile. "There's my favorite reader," Clara whispered, her voice thin as paper. Sophie climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, mindful of the wires and tubes. "I brought a new book," she said, holding up a well-worn copy of The Secret Garden. "It's about a girl who finds a hidden garden and brings it back to life. I thought maybe I could read it to you." "I'd like that," Clara said, and the look she gave Evan over Sophie's head was full of such love and gratitude that he had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. For the next hour, Sophie read aloud while Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, and Evan sat in his usual chair, watching the two people he loved most in the world find comfort in each other. This was his family now, he realized. This strange, broken, beautiful family built from loss and chance, and the courage to keep showing up. The call came 3 days later, at 2 a.m. Evan was deep in restless sleep when his phone buzzed on the nightstand, and he knew before he even saw Sandra's name on the screen that something had happened. "She's taken a turn," Sandra said without preamble. "You should come now." Evan was out of bed and pulling on clothes before his brain fully caught up. He called Marcus, who answered on the second ring despite the hour, and asked him to come stay with Sophie. Then he was in the car, breaking speed limits on empty streets, his heart hammering against his ribs. Please, he thought, though he didn't know who he was pleading with. Please let me get there in time. Please don't let her be alone. Please give us more time. The hospital at night was a different world, quieter, dimmer, haunted by the sounds of machines keeping people alive. Evan ran through corridors he could now navigate with his eyes closed, his footsteps echoing off tile floors, until he burst into Clara's room. She was awake, barely, surrounded by nurses and a doctor Evan didn't recognize. Monitors beeped urgent warnings, and the crash cart stood ready nearby, its presence making his blood run cold. "Evan?" Clara breathed when she saw him, and the relief in her voice was palpable. He pushed past the medical staff to get to her side, taking her hand in both of his. "I'm here. I'm right here." "Sir, we need space to work," the doctor said, but Sandra touched his arm gently. "Give them a minute," she said quietly, and something in her tone made the doctor nod and step back. Clara's eyes were unfocused but searching, finding Evan's face and holding onto it like an anchor. "I'm scared," she admitted, the words barely audible. I know, sweetheart." Evan brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "But you're not alone. You're never going to be alone again. I promise you that. Sophie will be fine. She's strong, just like you, and she'll know that you loved her, that you mattered to us. Tell her," Claire's breathing hitched, and the monitor's beeping grew more insistent. "Tell her the garden always comes back to life. Tell her to keep reading stories." "You'll tell her yourself," Evan said desperately. "You're going to fight through this, and you'll tell her yourself." Clara managed the smallest shake of her head. "Not running away this time, just tired, so tired." "Then rest," Evan said, tears streaming down his face. "Rest and get your strength back. I'll be right here when you wake up." "Promise?" "I promise." Clara's eyes drifted closed, and for a terrible moment Evan thought that was it, that he was watching her slip away. But then the doctor was there, gently moving Evan aside, and the nurses were working with practiced efficiency, and Sandra was pulling him back to give them room. "She's crashing," someone said, and then there was controlled chaos, medical terminology Evan didn't understand, the sharp smell of medication, the mechanical voice of someone calling out numbers and instructions. Evan stood frozen against the wall, watching them fight for Clara's life, feeling utterly helpless. This was what he'd feared from the beginning, what he'd tried to protect himself from, this moment of absolute powerlessness, where all you could do was watch and pray and hope that love was enough to keep someone tethered to the world. It took 20 minutes that felt like hours before the doctor finally stepped back, and the urgent beeping of the monitors settled into something steadier. Clara was still unconscious, her face pale as the sheets, but alive. Still here, still breathing. "She's stabilized," the doctor said, pulling off his gloves. "But barely. The cancer has progressed significantly, and her body is struggling to handle the treatment. We need to run more tests, but I have to be honest with you, this doesn't look good." "What are the options?" Evan asked, his voice hollow. "We can try to adjust the treatment protocol again, but at this point we're looking at diminishing returns. Her body might not be strong enough to handle more aggressive intervention." The doctor's expression was kind but clinical. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that we're running out of options." Running out of options. Medical speak for running out of time. After the medical team left, Evan pulled his chair close to Clara's bed and took her hand again. She looked so small, so fragile, dwarfed by the machinery keeping her alive. But she was still beautiful to him. Still the woman who'd changed everything just by being alone in a room he'd stumbled into by accident. "Don't you dare give up," he whispered to her unconscious form. "Don't you dare leave me now. We have too much left to do, too many conversations to have, too many days to spend together. Sophie needs you. I need you." The sun was rising when Clara finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find Evan still sitting beside her, still holding her hand. "You stayed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I promised, didn't I?" "You did." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Evan, I'm so tired of fighting." "I know, but please don't stop. Not yet. The doctors want to try a different approach, something less aggressive that your body can handle better. Clara studied his face for a long moment, and Evan could see her weighing options, calculating odds, trying to decide if hope was worth the continued suffering. "Will you stay with me?" she asked finally. "Through whatever comes next?" "Every step of the way," Evan said without hesitation. "You're not doing this alone anymore, Clara. Whatever you decide, whatever happens, we're in this together." "Together," Clara repeated, as if testing the word. Then, incredibly, she smiled. "I like the sound of that." Over the next week, Clara's condition remained precarious but stable. The doctors adjusted her treatment plan, focusing on quality of life over aggressive intervention, and slowly she began to stabilize. Not improve exactly, but stop actively dying, which felt like a miracle in itself. Evan took time off work, camping out in Clara's room with his laptop, fielding calls and emails while keeping one eye constantly on her. Sophie came every day after school, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes just sitting quietly doing homework while Clara slept. Marcus and Sarah started visiting too, bringing food and warmth and the kind of easy companionship that made the hospital room feel less like a place of suffering and more like somewhere people gathered because they wanted to. Clara's small, sterile room had become the unlikely center of a family that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. A family built from grief and kindness and the stubborn refusal to let someone suffer alone. On a gray Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after her crisis, Clara was sitting up for the first time in days when she asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "What happens if I survive this?" Evan looked up from his laptop, startled. They'd been so focused on just getting through each day that the possibility of a future beyond the hospital had seemed like dangerous optimism. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if by some miracle I beat this, if I get discharged and have to figure out how to live again, what happens to us?" Claire's hands twisted in the blanket covering her lap. "Is this something that only exists here, in this room? Or could it be real, out there in the world?" The vulnerability in her voice made Evan's heart ache. She was asking if he'd still want her when she wasn't a charity case anymore, when caring for her required more than hospital visits and gentle words. She was asking if what they had could survive outside the controlled environment where it was born. Evan closed his laptop and moved to sit on the edge of her bed, taking both her hands in his. "Clara, I need you to understand something. I didn't fall in love with your illness. I fell in love with your strength and your humor, and the way you listen to Sophie talk about books like it's the most important thing in the world. I fell in love with the way you challenge me, the way you make me want to be braver, the way you've helped me remember how to feel again." He lifted one of her hands to his lips. "If you survive this, when you survive this, I want to build a life with you. A real life, not just hospital visits. I want dinner dates and movie nights and lazy Sunday mornings. I want to watch you get healthy again. I want whatever future you're willing to share with me." "That's a lot to promise someone who might not have a future," Clara said, but she was smiling through fresh tears. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. One moment at a time if we have to. But Clara, I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me now." Clara leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "I've never been stuck with anyone before." "It sounds terrifying." "It is terrifying," Evan agreed. "But it's also the best thing that's ever happened to me." They stayed like that, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air, until Sophie's voice broke the moment. "Dad? Clara?" They looked up to find Sophie standing in the doorway with Marcus and Sarah, all three of them grinning like they'd just witnessed something wonderful. "Sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, not looking sorry at all. "But we brought pizza, and Sarah insisted we needed to have a proper family dinner, hospital room or not." "Family dinner," Sophie confirmed, marching in with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "Because that's what families do, right? They show up and eat pizza together even when someone's in the hospital." Clara looked at Evan, then at this unlikely group of people who'd invaded her room with food and love and unapologetic joy, and she started to laugh. Real laughter, the kind that came from deep in the belly and shook her whole fragile frame. "I can't believe this is my life," she said between laughs. "I can't believe you people are real." "We're very real," Sophie said, settling into her usual spot on the bed. "And you better get used to us, because we're not going anywhere." That evening, crowded into Clara's hospital room with pizza boxes and paper plates, and more laughter than those walls had probably ever heard, Evan looked around at this strange, beautiful family they'd built and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. Yes, Clara was still sick. Yes, the future was uncertain. Yes, there were hard days ahead and no guarantees about how this story would end. But right now, in this moment, they were all together. They were all choosing each other, and that felt like the most important thing in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked quietly, catching him staring. "How lucky I am that I walked into the wrong room," Evan said, taking her hand under the table where the others couldn't see. Clara squeezed his fingers. "Luckiest mistake either of us ever made." Across the room, Sophie was telling Marcus and Sarah about the book she was reading to Clara, her animated gestures nearly knocking over her soda. Sarah rescued the cup while Marcus laughed, and the whole scene was so beautifully, perfectly normal that Evan felt his eyes sting with tears he refused to let fall. This, he thought, this is what I was missing. Not just love, but belonging. Not just surviving, but living. The conversation turned to plans for Thanksgiving, which was only a week away. Marcus and Sarah wanted everyone to come to their house, but Sophie was insisting they should have it in Clara's room so she wouldn't be left out. "We could bring a turkey," Sophie was saying seriously. "A small one. And mashed potatoes. The nurses could eat with us." "I don't think they allow full Thanksgiving dinners in hospital rooms," Sarah said gently, but she was smiling at Sophie's determination. "Then we'll change the rules," Sophie declared. "Clara's part of our family now, and families have Thanksgiving together." Clara's breath caught audibly, and when Evan looked at her, he saw tears streaming silently down her face. But she was smiling, that brilliant, transformative smile that made her look almost healthy. "I'd really like that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'd really like to be part of your Thanksgiving." "Then it's settled," Marcus announced. "We're having Thanksgiving in room 412. Sandra's going to love this." Sandra did not, in fact, love this when Evan pitched the idea the next day. But she also didn't say no, which Evan took as tacit approval. Over the following week, he and Marcus quietly organized what would either be the most beautiful Thanksgiving Clara had ever experienced or a spectacular violation of hospital policy that would get them all kicked out. Probably both, Evan thought, and decided he didn't care. Clara's test results came back the day before Thanksgiving, and Evan was there when the doctor delivered the news. He'd learned to read the doctor's expressions by now, had become fluent in the subtle language of medical updates. So when Dr. Patel walked in with her usual professional demeanor, but eyes that held something different, Evan felt his heart start to race. "The results are interesting," Dr. Patel said, pulling up Clara's charts on the computer. "The tumors have stopped growing." The words hung in the air like a held breath. "Stopped growing?" Clara repeated, her voice small and afraid to hope. "They haven't shrunk significantly, but they've stopped progressing. Your body is finally responding to the treatment." Dr. Patel smiled, the first time Evan had seen her do so. "It's not a cure, but it's good news, Clara. Very good news." Clara looked at Evan, her eyes wide with disbelief and desperate hope, and he felt something crack open in his chest. Not bad news for once. Not worse. Actually, genuinely good news. "What does this mean?" Evan asked, because Clara seemed incapable of speech. "It means we continue the current treatment protocol and monitor closely. It means that discharge is a possibility we can start discussing, though not for a few more weeks at least. It means—" Dr. Patel looked directly at Clara, her expression warm. "It means you're fighting, and your body is finally fighting with you instead of against you." After the doctor left, Clara and Evan sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then Clara started laughing and crying at the same time, and Evan was holding her, and they were both shaking with relief and joy and the cautious, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, they might actually get their chance at a future together. "I might actually get out of here," Clara whispered against his shoulder. "I might actually get to see what life looks like outside these walls." "You will," Evan said fiercely. "You're going to get out of here, and we're going to have that life we talked about." "Promise?" "I promise." Thanksgiving in room 412 was everything Sophie had imagined and more. Marcus and Sarah smuggled in enough food to feed a small army, Sandra looked the other way while setting up extra chairs. And for one evening, the hospital room transformed into something that looked a lot like home. They couldn't fit a full turkey, so they made do with roasted chicken. The mashed potatoes came from the hospital cafeteria, but tasted perfect when shared among people who loved each other. Sophie made a centerpiece from construction paper and markers, a lopsided cornucopia that Clara insisted was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. Before they ate, Marcus raised his plastic cup of apple juice. "I think we should go around and say what we're thankful for," he said. "I'll start. I'm thankful for friendship that lasts even when I'm a terrible patient, and for my wife who puts up with all my terrible jokes." "I'm thankful for my family," Sarah said, squeezing Marcus's hand. "All of it, even the parts that surprised us." "I'm thankful for books," Sophie announced, "and for Clara being alive to hear me read them." Everyone looked at Clara then, waiting. She took a shaky breath, her eyes shining. "I'm thankful for wrong doors," she said, looking at Evan. "For second chances. For families that choose you when you thought you'd always be alone. For the possibility of tomorrow." Her voice broke. "For all of you." When it was Evan's turn, he found he couldn't speak around the lump in his throat. So he just raised his cup and said the only thing that mattered. "I'm thankful for this moment, exactly as it is." They ate and laughed and told stories, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Evan looked around the crowded hospital room and realized that walking into the wrong door hadn't been a mistake at all. It had been exactly what he needed to find his way home. The news about Clara's stabilized condition became the foundation they built on through December, each passing day adding another layer of cautious optimism to what had felt like inevitable tragedy. The tumors weren't shrinking, but they weren't growing either, and in the mathematics of cancer, that stalemate meant everything. Dr. Patel began using words like remission and discharge planning, though always with careful qualifiers and the reminder that Clara's fight was far from over. But even those qualified hopes felt like miracles after weeks of watching her slip away by degrees. The physical changes came slowly. Clara's appetite returned first, trading nausea for genuine hunger that had her actually looking forward to hospital meals. Her color improved, the translucent pallor giving way to something that looked more like life. She started staying awake for longer stretches, engaging in full conversations instead of drifting away mid-sentence. But the emotional changes were what struck Evan most profoundly. Clara started talking about the future in concrete terms rather than hypotheticals. She'd mentioned spring as if she expected to see it, reference books she wanted to read as if she'd have time to finish them, make casual plans for after discharge as if that was actually going to happen. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I get out of here," she said one evening in early December while Evan was helping her with dinner. Sophie was at a sleepover, so they had rare time alone together. "I know I'll need physical therapy, and there will be follow-up treatments, but eventually I want to work again, do something meaningful." "What kind of work?" Evan asked, cutting her chicken into manageable pieces without making it obvious that's what he was doing. "I used to be a teacher, elementary school, second grade. I loved it." Clara's expression grew distant, remembering. "I had to leave when I got sick, when the treatments made it impossible to keep up with the energy 25 7-year-olds require. But maybe, if I get strong enough, I could go back. Or tutor privately. Something where I'm still helping kids learn." The longing in her voice was palpable, and Evan realized this was the first time she'd really shared details about her life before cancer. The first time she'd allowed herself to imagine reclaiming pieces of who she used to be. "You'd be amazing at that," he said. "Sophie lights up whenever you talk to her about books. You have this way of making kids feel heard." Clara smiled, but it was tinged with uncertainty. "It feels presumptuous to make plans, like I'm jinxing myself by hoping too much. Or maybe hoping is exactly what you need to keep fighting." Evan set down the fork and took her hand. "You're allowed to want things, Clara. You're allowed to imagine a future where you're not defined by being sick." "I've been sick for so long, I'm not sure who I am without it," she admitted quietly. "What if I get out there and discover I've forgotten how to be a person who's just living? Then we'll figure it out together, you, me, and Sophie. We'll teach you how to live again, and you'll teach us how to be braver." He squeezed her fingers gently. "That's what families do, right? They help each other remember who they are." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Family, I still can't believe I get to have that." "Believe it," Evan said. Because we're not going anywhere. The conversation stayed with Evan long after he left the hospital that night. Driving home through streets decorated with Christmas lights, he found himself thinking about what life might actually look like with Clara in it beyond hospital visits. Morning coffee together, helping her rebuild her strength, watching her interact with Sophie in normal, everyday ways instead of the heightened emotions of a sick room. Building something real and lasting instead of just surviving crisis to crisis. The thought terrified him as much as it excited him. What if the intimacy they'd found in that hospital room couldn't survive the mundane realities of regular life? What if Clara got healthy and realized she didn't need him anymore? What if he'd fallen in love with the version of her that existed in crisis, and the healthy Clara was someone different? But deeper than the fear was a growing certainty that he wanted to find out. That whatever came next, he wanted to face it with Clara beside him. 2 weeks before Christmas, Dr. Patel gave them the news they'd been hoping for. "If you continue improving at this rate, I think we can discharge you after the first of the year," she told Clara, and the words sent a jolt of pure joy through Evan's chest. "You'll need to come back regularly for monitoring and treatment, and you'll be on a strict medication regimen. But, Clara, you're going home." Going home. Except Clara didn't have a home anymore, Evan realized with a start. She'd lost her apartment when she couldn't pay rent during her illness, had sold most of her possessions to cover medical bills. Going home meant going... where exactly? Clara's face showed she'd just had the same realization. The joy dimmed slightly, replaced by anxiety. "I'll need to find a place," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Something affordable, close to the hospital for appointments. Maybe I can look at some listings online, see what's available." Or, Evan heard himself say before he'd fully thought it through, "You could stay with us." Clara's head snapped toward him. "What?" "Stay with us. At my house. We have a guest room that nobody uses. It's on the first floor, so you wouldn't have to deal with stairs while you're recovering. And it would mean Sophie and I could help with whatever you need." The words were coming faster now, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "I know it's a lot to ask, living with someone you've only known a few months, but, Clara, it doesn't make sense for you to be alone while you're still recovering, not when we want you with us anyway." "Evan, that's too much," Clara protested, but he could see the hope blooming in her eyes even as she tried to be practical. "You've already done so much. I can't impose on your life like that." "It's not imposing if I'm asking, if we're asking." He moved closer to her bed, taking both her hands. "Sophie and I have talked about this, actually. She's been planning which stuffed animals you should have in your room and everything. We want you there, Clara, not out of obligation or charity, but because your family and families live together." Dr. Patel, who'd been quietly observing this exchange, cleared her throat. "From a medical standpoint, having a support system during recovery significantly improves outcomes. If Mr. Brooks is offering and you're comfortable with it, I'd strongly recommend accepting." Clara looked between them, clearly struggling with a decision that involved both practical needs and emotional vulnerability. Evan could see her weighing independence against loneliness, pride against practicality, fear against hope. "What if I'm a terrible house guest?" she finally asked, and Evan knew she was going to say yes. "What if my medical needs are overwhelming? What if Sophie gets tired of having a sick person in her house?" "Then we'll figure it out together, just like everything else," Evan said. "But Clara, I've watched you fight cancer with more grace and strength than I knew was possible. I'm not worried about you being a good house guest. I'm only worried about you being alone when you don't have to be." Clara closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. When she opened them again, there was surrender in her expression, but the good kind. The kind that came from finally allowing yourself to be cared for. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay with you." The relief that washed over Evan was almost physical. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, breathing in the moment. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I should be thanking you." "Then we'll just keep thanking each other and call it even." Dr. Patel smiled as she left them alone, and Evan had the distinct impression she'd been hoping for exactly this outcome. Telling Sophie that Clara would be moving in was met with exactly the enthusiasm Evan had expected. His daughter literally jumped up and down in the hospital parking lot when he shared the news, then immediately started making plans. "She can have the guest room, and we'll get her those soft blankets she likes, and I can read to her every night before bed, and we can have breakfast together every morning, and..." Sophie was talking so fast she was almost tripping over her words. "Slow down, sweetheart," Evan said, laughing. "She'll be recovering, remember? We need to make sure she has quiet time and space to rest." I know, but Dad, she's coming home. Clara's really coming home with us." The wonder in Sophie's voice made Evan's chest tight. His daughter had been so careful with her heart since Emma died, keeping people at a distance, never quite letting herself fully attach to anyone outside their small family unit. But she'd fallen for Clara completely, and now she got to keep her. They all did. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Evan found himself doing things he hadn't done since before Emma got sick, making space in his life for someone new, preparing a room for another person, imagining shared routines and daily rhythms that included someone beyond just him and Sophie. He painted the guest room a soft blue that Clara had mentioned liking. Sophie helped him hang curtains and arrange furniture, debating optimal placement for the reading chair and lamp. Marcus and Sarah donated extra blankets and pillows, helping create a space that felt warm and welcoming rather than clinical. The house itself seemed to wake up in preparation, shedding some of the stagnant grief that had settled into its corners. Evan found himself fixing things he'd been putting off for years: the wobbly table, the loose cabinet door, the upstairs bathroom fixtures that had sat uninstalled since Emma's diagnosis, as if making the house whole again was part of making room for Clara in their lives. Christmas came with Clara still in the hospital, but stronger than she'd been in months. Evan and Sophie brought the holiday to her, decorating her room with a small tree and stringing lights around the windows. They had Christmas dinner together in room 412, a tradition now, with Marcus and Sarah, and even some of the nurses joining in. Clara gave Sophie a necklace she'd had Sandra buy for her, a small silver book charm that made Sophie cry happy tears. For Evan, she'd written a letter that she handed him nervously, watching as he read her words about gratitude and hope and the unexpected miracle of finding family when she'd stopped looking. "I don't have much," Clara said when he looked up with wet eyes. "Everything I owned got sold or lost during treatment, but I wanted you to have something from me, something that mattered." "This is everything," Evan said, carefully folding the letter. "This is perfect." He gave her a key. Simple, silver, attached to a keychain that read, "Home." "To our house," he explained when she looked at him questioningly. "So you know you always have a place to go, that you belong somewhere now." Clara clutched the key like it was the most precious thing she'd ever been given, and maybe it was. Not because of its material value, but because of what it represented: security, belonging, a future. New Year's Eve found them counting down to midnight in Clara's hospital room, watching the ball drop on the small TV mounted to the wall. When the clock struck 12, Evan kissed Clara for the first time, gentle, careful, full of promise. Sophie cheered, and the nurses in the hallway applauded, and Clara laughed against his lips. "Best New Year's ever," she whispered. "Just wait," Evan said. "Next year we'll be in our house, and it'll be even better." Our house. The words felt right in a way that made his heart full. Discharge day came on January 8th, a cold Tuesday morning with fresh snow on the ground. Evan arrived early to find Clara already dressed in real clothes for the first time in months. Jeans that hung loose on her diminished frame, a soft sweater Sophie had picked out, her own shoes instead of hospital socks. She looked terrified and excited in equal measure. "I don't remember how to do this," she admitted, as Evan helped her pack her few belongings. "How to be out there? What if I've forgotten how to be normal?" "Nobody's normal," Evan assured her. "And we'll figure it out together, remember? One day at a time." The discharge process took hours. Medical instructions and prescriptions and follow-up appointments all carefully documented. Sandra hugged Clara goodbye with tears in her eyes, making her promise to come visit. Other nurses stopped by to wish her well, these women who'd cared for her through the worst of it now celebrating her victory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of paperwork and goodbyes, Evan was wheeling Clara out of the hospital in the mandatory wheelchair, Sophie walking alongside them, carrying a balloon bouquet that declared, "Welcome home." The winter air hit them like a shock after months of climate-controlled hospital. Clara tilted her face up to the weak sunshine, breathing deep, and Evan saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "Real air," she said wonderingly. "I'd forgotten what real air feels like." Getting her into the car required careful maneuvering, her body still weak and easily tired. But once she was settled in the passenger seat with the seatbelt adjusted and Sophie chattering excitedly from the back, Evan started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. Clara pressed her hand against the window as the hospital grew smaller in the rearview mirror, and Evan understood what she was feeling. Relief and fear, and the strange vertigo of leaving a place that had been both prison and sanctuary. "You okay?" he asked softly. Clara turned to look at him, and despite the tears still streaming, she was smiling. "I'm perfect. I'm going home." The drive to Evan's house took 20 minutes through streets Clara had probably traveled countless times before, but was seeing now with new eyes. Everything looked different when you'd spent months thinking you might never see the outside world again. The snow-covered trees, the houses with their Christmas decorations still up, the normal people going about normal lives, all of it felt like a gift. Sophie kept up a running commentary from the back seat, pointing out landmarks and explaining which neighbors had dogs and which streets flooded when it rained hard. Clara listened with the attention of someone memorizing details, filing away information about this neighborhood that would be hers now too. When they pulled into the driveway, Evan saw Clara's breath catch. The house was small and imperfect, still showing signs of years of deferred maintenance. But Marcus and Sarah had strung white lights along the porch railing and hung a "Welcome Home Clara" banner across the door. "They did this morning," Evan explained. "Wanted you to know you were expected. That this isn't just my house, or Sophie's house. It's ours now." Clara couldn't speak. She just nodded, pressing her hand to her mouth. Getting her inside required slow movement and frequent rest, her stamina still limited despite her improvement. But finally she was standing in the living room, looking around at the space that would be her home now. The worn furniture, the photos on the mantel, the half-finished renovation projects that told the story of interrupted plans. "It's perfect," Clara said, and meant it. Sophie grabbed her hand eagerly. "Come see your room. We worked really hard on it." They led her down the short hallway to the guest room, and when Evan opened the door, Clara stopped in the threshold. The blue walls glowed in the afternoon light. The bed was made with the soft blankets she'd mentioned loving. Books lined a small shelf, Mary Oliver's poetry, novels Clara had expressed interest in, Sophie's favorite stories. The reading chair sat by the window, positioned perfectly to catch natural light, and on the dresser sat the small vase of daisies, the same kind Evan had brought that very first day. "This is mine?" Clara asked, her voice breaking. "All yours," Evan confirmed, "for as long as you want it." Clara walked slowly into the room, touching things gently, as if afraid they might disappear. She picked up one of the books, traced the spine of the chair, stood at the window looking out at the backyard where snow covered everything in peaceful white. "I had an apartment before I got sick," she said quietly, "but it never felt like this, never felt like home. This—" She turned to face them, tears streaming freely now. "This feels like love." Sophie launched herself at Clara, wrapping her arms around her waist carefully, mindful of her fragility. "Because it is love. You're family now." Evan joined the embrace, the three of them holding each other in that blue room, and felt something settle in his chest. This was right. This was exactly where they were all supposed to be. The first week was an adjustment for everyone. Clara tired easily, needing frequent naps and help with tasks she'd once done without thinking. Her medication schedule was complex, requiring alarms and careful tracking. Some days the pain was manageable, others it left her breathless and pale. But there were also small joys that outweighed the challenges. Morning coffee together at the kitchen table, Sophie chattering about school while Clara listened with genuine interest, helping Clara shower and dress without making it feel clinical or shameful. Reading together in the evenings, three bodies curled up on the couch with blankets and books. The simple normalcy of shared meals and quiet conversations, and someone else's presence filling the empty spaces. Evan found himself hyper-aware of Clara's needs, sometimes too much so. He'd hover, asking if she needed anything, if she was comfortable, if she was in pain. Finally, after a few days, Clara gently called him out on it. "Evan, I love you, but you're going to drive me crazy if you keep asking if I'm okay every 10 minutes. I'm sorry, I just want to make sure. I know what you want, but I need you to trust that I'll tell you if I need something. I need to feel like a person living in a house, not a patient being monitored. She softened her words with a smile. I spent months with nurses checking on me constantly. Here, I need to feel like I have some autonomy, even if that means struggling a bit sometimes. It was a fair point, and Evan tried to pull back to find the balance between attentive and overbearing. It wasn't easy. Loving someone who'd come so close to dying made you want to wrap them in bubble wrap and never let anything hurt them again. But Clara was right. She needed to reclaim her independence, to remember how to be someone beyond her illness. Sophie, surprisingly, handled this better than Evan. She treated Clara with the same easy affection she'd shown in the hospital, asking for help with homework, requesting story time, including her in every small decision about their daily life. She didn't tiptoe around Clara's limitations, but also didn't make a big deal of them. Can you help me with my book report? Sophie would ask, even though Clara sometimes needed to rest between paragraphs. Should we have tacos or pasta for dinner? As if Clara's opinion carried equal weight. Want to watch a movie tonight? Without worrying that Clara might fall asleep halfway through. She treated Clara like family, and in doing so, helped her become exactly that. 2 weeks into Clara's stay at the house, Evan woke in the middle of the night to strange sounds from downstairs. He found Clara in the kitchen, sitting at the table in the dark, crying quietly. Hey, he said softly, not wanting to startle her. What's wrong? Are you in pain? Clara shook her head, wiping at her tears. No, I couldn't sleep, and I came down here and there were dishes in the sink and mail on the counter and Sophie's backpack on the chair, and it just hit me that this is real, that I actually live here, that I have a home again. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears but smiling. I keep waiting to wake up back in that hospital room and discover this was all a dream, that you and Sophie don't really exist, that nobody actually chose me. Evan crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. We're real. This is real. You're not going anywhere. I'm so scared of losing this, Clara whispered against his chest. Of the cancer coming back, of my body betraying me again, of having to watch you and Sophie go through what I went through in that hospital. I'm terrified that I finally found everything I ever wanted, and it's going to be taken away. I'm scared too, Evan admitted. Every day. But Clara, even if the worst happens, even if we don't get as much time as we want, wouldn't you rather have had this? Wouldn't you rather have loved and been loved than stayed alone to avoid the pain? Clara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier. Yes, even if it ends badly, this is worth it. You and Sophie are worth it. They stood like that in the dark kitchen, holding each other, acknowledging their fears without letting those fears control them. It felt like a turning point, an acceptance that they were choosing each other not in spite of the uncertainty, but because of it. Because life was uncertain for everyone, and the only real choice was whether to face it alone or together. Come back to bed, Evan said finally, or stay up with me. We can make tea and watch bad late-night TV. Tea and bad TV sounds perfect, Clara said, and let him lead her to the couch. They spent the rest of the night curled together under blankets, watching infomercials and talking about nothing important, and somehow it felt more intimate than any grand gesture. This was the real work of building a life together, showing up in the dark hours, sitting with fear, choosing each other again and again. As January gave way to February, Clara grew stronger. Physical therapy helped her regain stamina. The pain became more manageable. Her hair started growing back in soft, dark curls that Sophie loved to touch gently. She still had appointments and scans and the constant specter of relapse hanging over her, but the good days started outnumbering the bad ones. She began helping around the house in small ways, folding laundry, helping Sophie with homework, attempting to cook dinner, though Evan usually ended up taking over when she got tired. She was building a routine, carving out a space in their life that was uniquely hers. One evening in mid-February, Evan came home from work to find Clara and Sophie in the kitchen together, flour everywhere, and laughter filling the air. We're making cookies, Sophie announced proudly. Clara's teaching me her grandmother's recipe. It was the one thing I insisted on taking from my childhood, Clara explained, wiping flour from her nose. This recipe card. I've had it for 20 years but never had anyone to bake with. Until now. Evan watched them work together, Sophie measuring carefully while Clara guided her, and felt his heart swell almost painfully. This was what he'd hoped for but been afraid to imagine. Clara healthy enough to teach, Sophie confident enough to learn, both of them comfortable in a kitchen that had felt too quiet for too long. That night, after Sophie went to bed with a stomach full of warm cookies, Clara and Evan sat on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in blankets and watching the stars. "I've been thinking about something," Clara said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "And I don't want you to feel pressured or think I'm rushing things, but I need to ask." Evan's heart started beating faster. "Okay. What are we building here? You and me, I mean. Is this temporary? Are you waiting for me to get stronger so I can move out and we can go back to being separate people? Or is this—" She paused, searching for words. "Is this permanent? Are we building something that lasts?" The question hung between them, enormous in its implications. Evan thought about how to answer, how to put into words what he'd been feeling for months now. "Clara, when I asked you to move in, it wasn't just about helping you recover. It was because I couldn't imagine my life without you in it anymore. Every day with you here feels right in a way nothing has felt right since Emma died." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I'm not waiting for you to leave. I'm hoping you'll stay. Forever, if you'll have us." Clara's eyes were shining with tears in the starlight. "Forever is a long time for someone with my medical history." "Then we'll take it one day at a time. But Clara, I'm in this, completely. I want to build a life with you, whatever that looks like. Even though I come with cancer and debt and enough emotional baggage to fill this entire house?" "Especially because of all that," Evan said firmly. "Because you're the bravest person I've ever met, and you've taught me how to hope again. You and Sophie are my family, and I don't want that to ever change." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars and feeling the weight and wonder of choosing each other again. "Then stay," Evan said into the quiet February night. "Not as a guest, not temporarily. Stay as my partner, as Sophie's family, as someone who belongs here permanently." Clara lifted her head from his shoulder, searching his face in the dim porch light. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" Evan's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This wasn't how he'd planned to do this, sitting on a cold porch wrapped in blankets, both of them in sweatpants and old sweaters. But maybe that was exactly right. Maybe the most important moments didn't need perfect staging, just perfect honesty. "I'm saying I love you, Clara Hale. I'm saying I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I'm saying that when I think about my future, you're in every single image. You and Sophie and me building something real." He cupped her face gently in his hands. "I'm not asking you to marry me tonight. I know we need more time, that you need to get stronger, that we have to be sure. But I'm asking you to choose this, to choose us, to stop waiting for permission to be happy and just be happy." Tears streamed down Clara's face, catching the starlight. "I'm still sick, Evan. The cancer could come back. I might need more treatment, more surgeries, more time in hospitals. You'd be signing up for all of that." "I know, and I'm choosing it anyway. I'm choosing you, Clara, all of you, the healthy days and the hard days and everything in between." Clara laughed through her tears, the sound bright and disbelieving. "You're absolutely crazy, you know that? Falling in love with a cancer patient you met by walking into the wrong room." "Best wrong turn I ever made," Evan said, echoing her words from months ago. Clara kissed him then, deep and certain, and when they broke apart she was smiling wider than he'd ever seen. "Yes. My answer is yes. To all of it. To building a life with you, to being Sophie's family, to staying here permanently, yes." They held each other on that cold porch until the chill became too much, then moved inside to warmth and possibility. That night, for the first time, Clara didn't sleep in the guest room. She fell asleep in Evan's arms in his bed, in their bed, and when morning came, they woke up together. Sophie found them at breakfast, sitting close at the kitchen table with their hands intertwined, and her face lit up with understanding. "Are you guys together now? Like, officially?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "Officially," Clara confirmed, smiling. "If that's okay with you?" "Okay? It's perfect. Can I call you Mom?" The question landed in the kitchen like a gentle bomb. Clara's eyes went wide, filling with tears, and Evan felt his own throat tighten. Sophie had stopped calling anyone Mom 3 years ago, had carefully avoided the word even though they'd told her it was okay to use it for Emma's memory. Sophie, honey, you don't have to, Evan started, but Clara held up a hand. Only if you want to, Clara said to Sophie, her voice shaking. I would never want to replace your mother. She'll always be your mom, the one who gave you life and loved you first. But if you want me to be another mom, a different kind of mom, I would be honored beyond words. Sophie thought about this seriously, her face scrunched in concentration. I think people can have more than one mom. One who's in heaven and one who's here. Both of them real. Both of them important. I think you're absolutely right, Clara said, opening her arms. Sophie crashed into her embrace, and over her daughter's head, Evan met Clara's eyes. In them he saw joy and fear and overwhelming gratitude all mixed together. She was being given the gift of motherhood, the family she'd thought she'd never have, and the weight of that gift was written across her face. They spent the morning together as a family, making plans and talking about the future in concrete ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Clara wanted to know about Sophie's school, her friends, her activities. Sophie wanted to know if Clara would come to her soccer games, help with school projects, be there for the boring Tuesday nights as much as the special occasions. All of it, Clara promised. I want to be there for all of it. That afternoon, while Sophie was at a friend's house, Evan and Clara went ring shopping. Not for an engagement ring yet, but for something that marked this commitment they were making to each other. They found a small jewelry store downtown, the kind of place that had been there for decades, run by an elderly couple who reminded Evan of what he hoped he and Clara might become someday. Clara chose a simple silver band with a tiny inscription inside that read, "Choose Joy." It fit her perfectly, sliding onto her right ring finger like it had been made for her. It's a promise ring, she explained to Evan. A promise that I'm going to keep choosing joy, keep choosing life, keep choosing you and Sophie every single day. Evan bought a matching one, and they stood in that small shop, sliding rings onto each other's fingers and making promises that felt as binding as any wedding vow. March brought warmer weather and Clara's 3-month post-discharge checkup. The scan results would determine whether the cancer remained stable or if they were facing a new battle. The days leading up to the appointment were tense, both of them trying to stay positive while privately wrestling with worst-case scenarios. What if it's back? Clara asked the night before the scan, lying in bed with her head on Evan's chest. What if this whole thing was just borrowed time? Then we'll fight it again, Evan said firmly, but together this time, not with you alone in a hospital room, but with all of us beside you. I'm not sure I'm strong enough to go through it again. You're the strongest person I know, but Clara, you don't have to be strong alone anymore. That's what I'm here for. That's what Sophie's here for. We'll be strong when you can't be. Clara turned her face into his chest, and Evan felt her tears soak through his shirt. He held her while she cried, while she let herself acknowledge the fear she'd been carrying, and he made silent promises to whatever forces might be listening that they'd get through this, that Clara would be okay, that their story wouldn't end just when it was really beginning. The scan itself was routine, Clara disappearing into the massive machine while Evan waited with clenched fists and racing thoughts. Then came the hardest part, the 3 days of waiting for results, trying to maintain normal life while terror lurked beneath every conversation. Sophie knew something was up but didn't push, just stayed closer to both of them than usual, as if her physical presence could anchor them through the uncertainty. Dr. Patel called on a Thursday afternoon. Evan was at work when his phone rang, Clara's name flashing on the screen, and his heart stopped. The results are in, Clara said, and he couldn't read her tone. Can you come home? I'm leaving right now. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of Evan's life. He kept trying to prepare himself for bad news, kept telling himself that they'd survive whatever came. But underneath the rational thoughts was pure, visceral fear. He found Clara sitting on the porch, even though it was chilly, staring at the street. When she heard his car, she stood up, and the expression on her face made his knees weak. She was smiling. Clear, Clara said as he reached her. The scans are completely clear, no new tumors, and the old ones have shrunk by 30%. Dr. Patel said whatever we're doing is working, and I should keep doing exactly that. Evan couldn't speak. He just grabbed her, lifting her off the ground despite her protests about being careful, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. You're okay, he kept repeating. You're really okay. I'm really okay. Clara confirmed, and when he set her down, she framed his face with her hands. We get more time, Evan. We actually get more time. They called Sophie at school, got permission to pull her out early, and took her to her favorite ice cream place to celebrate. Sophie wanted to know every detail, making Dr. Patel's medical explanation sound like the most exciting story she'd ever heard. So, the cancer is almost gone? Sophie asked, chocolate ice cream smeared on her chin. Not gone yet, Clara said carefully, but getting smaller, which means the treatment is working and my body is fighting back. Your body is awesome, Sophie declared with the certainty of a 9-year-old. It's like a superhero fighting the bad guys. It is pretty awesome, Clara agreed, reaching across the table to squeeze Evan's hand, especially with all the help it's been getting. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Evan and Clara sat in their bedroom now, not just his, and talked about the future with a hope that felt less fragile than before. I want to go back to teaching, Clara said. Maybe not full-time right away, but substitute teaching or tutoring. I miss working with kids. I miss feeling useful. You're already useful. You help Sophie with her homework every night. That's different. I want to work, Evan. I want to contribute, to have a purpose beyond just surviving cancer. Then we'll make it happen, Evan said. Whatever you need. Clara was quiet for a moment, then took a deep breath. I also want to marry you. Not someday, not eventually, soon. This summer, maybe. I don't want to wait for perfect timing or complete health or any of the things people usually wait for. I just want to be your wife. Evan's heart felt too big for his chest. Is this a proposal? Maybe it is, Clara said, smiling nervously. I know it's supposed to be the other way around, but I've spent too long waiting for other people to choose me. I want to choose you, actively and publicly. I want Sophie to be our daughter officially. I want to build this family we've created into something permanent and legal and real. Clara Hale, are you asking me to marry you? Yes, she said firmly. Evan Brooks, will you marry me? Evan didn't even pretend to think about it. Yes, absolutely yes. Tomorrow if you want. They kissed like they were sealing a deal, which they were, and then they were laughing and planning and imagining what their wedding might look like. Not big, they agreed, not traditional or formal, just them and Sophie and the people who'd helped them become a family. They told Sophie the next morning, and her shriek of joy probably woke the neighbors. She immediately started making plans, declaring herself the maid of honor and insisting on having input on everything from flowers to cake flavors. Can we have the wedding in our backyard? Sophie asked. That way Clara won't get too tired and we can make it exactly how we want. It was perfect, and they spent the next few months planning a wedding that reflected who they were. Simple, intimate, focused on love rather than spectacle. Marcus would officiate, having gotten ordained online for the occasion. Sarah would handle the food. Sophie would carry flowers and stand beside both of them during the ceremony. Clara found a dress at a small boutique. Nothing like the elaborate gowns in bridal magazines, but perfect for her. Cream-colored and flowing, comfortable enough to wear for hours without exhausting her still recovering body. Evan wore the suit he'd bought for Emma's funeral and felt no guilt about it. Emma would have loved Clara, would have approved of this next chapter. As summer approached, Clara grew stronger. She started substitute teaching at Sophie's school just a few days a week at first, and came home energized rather than exhausted. The kids loved her, and she loved them back, finding purpose and joy in the work she'd thought she'd lost forever. Her hair grew back fully, dark curls that she wore short and natural. The weight she'd lost in the hospital slowly returned, filling out her frame until she looked less fragile and more vibrant. She still had appointments and scans, still took medication daily, still had moments when pain or fatigue reminded them all that cancer was a battle without a definitive end. But the good days far outnumbered the bad ones now. On a Saturday morning in June, while Sophie was at soccer practice, Evan and Clara worked together on the final wedding preparations. They were stringing lights in the backyard when Clara suddenly stopped, her hand pressed to her chest. "What's wrong?" Evan asked immediately, dropping the lights and moving to her side. "Are you in pain? Should I call Dr. Patel?" "No, nothing like that." Clara looked at him with wonder in her eyes. "I just realized something. I'm happy. Genuinely, completely happy. Not happy despite the cancer, or happy for now, or happy with qualifications. Just happy. Evan pulled her close, understanding the significance of what she was saying. For someone who'd spent so long defined by illness and loneliness, uncomplicated happiness was its own kind of miracle. Me too, he said. I didn't think I'd ever feel this way again after Emma died. But Clara, you've taught me that it's possible to love again without it diminishing what came before. That opening your heart after loss isn't betrayal, it's survival. We saved each other, Clara said softly. You walked into that wrong room and saved me from dying alone. And I think maybe I saved you from living alone, from forgetting how to hope. Best wrong turn either of us ever made. The wedding day arrived warm and perfect, the kind of June day that felt designed specifically for celebration. They'd kept the guest list small: Marcus and Sarah, a few colleagues from Evan's work, some of Sophie's teachers who'd become Clara's friends, Sandra and several nurses from the hospital who'd cared for Clara during her darkest days. The backyard had been transformed with white lights and flowers, simple decorations that made the space feel magical without being overwhelming. Chairs were set up on the grass, and Marcus stood at the front, grinning broadly in his suit. Sophie, wearing a purple dress she'd picked out herself, was vibrating with excitement as she helped Clara get ready in the bedroom. You look like a princess, Sophie declared, adjusting Clara's simple flower crown. A real one, not a Disney one. I feel like one, Clara said, studying herself in the mirror. She looked healthy, radiant, alive in ways that seemed impossible compared to the hollow-eyed woman Evan had found in that hospital room just 8 months ago. Are you nervous? Sophie asked. Not even a little bit, Clara said honestly. I'm marrying your dad and I'm becoming your mom officially. I've never been more certain of anything. Good, Sophie said, satisfied. Because we're never letting you go. The ceremony itself was simple and perfect. Clara walked down the makeshift aisle alone, having no one to give her away but giving herself freely. Sophie stood between them, holding both their hands, a physical representation of the family they'd become. Marcus's words were personal and heartfelt, speaking to the journey that had brought them all together, to the courage it took to love again after loss, to the miracle of finding family in unexpected places. Evan and Clara, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. You've both known profound loss. You've both survived things that could have destroyed you, but you chose each other anyway. You chose hope anyway. And in doing so, you've created something beautiful and rare, a family built not on obligation or tradition, but on pure choice. That's the strongest foundation any family can have. When it came time for vows, Clara went first, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Evan, 8 months ago I was alone in a hospital room, convinced I would die that way, forgotten and invisible. Then you walked through the wrong door and saw me. Really saw me. Not just the cancer, not just the dying woman, but me. You chose me when I'd given up on being chosen. You taught me that it's possible to be loved not in spite of being broken, but because of all the ways we've survived our breaking. She paused, squeezing his hands. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to show up for you the way you've shown up for me. I promise to be brave enough to hope, to love, to live fully instead of just surviving. And I promise to be the best mother I can be to Sophie, honoring the mother she lost while trying to give her the mother she deserves now. Evan had to take a moment to compose himself before speaking, looking at this woman who'd changed everything, who'd taught him how to live again. Clara, I thought my life was over when Emma died. I thought the best I could hope for was going through the motions, being there for Sophie, but never really being present. Then I made a mistake, walked into the wrong room, and found you. His voice broke, and he didn't try to hide it. You taught me that love isn't about perfect timing or perfect circumstances. It's about courage. It's about choosing to open your heart even when you know it could break again. You taught me that sometimes the wrong door leads you exactly where you need to be. He glanced at Sophie, including her in his vows. I promise to love you and support you through whatever comes. Through scans and treatments, through good days and hard days, through everything. I promise to never let you feel alone again. And I promise that our family, you, me, and Sophie, will always be built on showing up, choosing each other, and refusing to let fear keep us from living fully. When they exchanged rings, Clara's simple band joined by a matching wedding ring, Evan's promise ring replaced by one Clara had chosen for him. Sophie cheered so loudly that everyone laughed. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Marcus said, beaming. "Evan, kiss your bride." And he did, to applause and cheers and Sophie's delighted whooping. The reception was low-key and joyful, exactly what they'd wanted. They ate food Sarah had prepared, cut a small cake that Sophie had helped decorate somewhat lopsidedly, and danced on the grass to music playing from someone's phone. It wasn't elegant or sophisticated, but it was real, and it was theirs. Sandra pulled Clara aside at one point, tears in her eyes. "I'm so glad you made it here," she said. "There were days I wasn't sure you would, but you fought so hard. And now look at you, married, healthy, happy. You deserve all of this, Clara." "I couldn't have done it without you," Clara said, hugging her tightly. "Without all of you at the hospital, who saw me through the worst of it, who treated me like a person even when I felt like nothing more than a diagnosis." Later, as the sun set and the lights in the backyard came on, creating a canopy of stars overhead, Evan found himself standing with Clara at the edge of the gathering, watching their friends and family celebrate. "What are you thinking?" Clara asked, leaning into his side. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," Evan said honestly. "That somehow, impossibly, walking into the wrong room led me to everything I needed, to you, to this family, to remembering how to be happy." "We're both lucky," Clara said, "and we're both brave. That's what this is, Evan. Not luck, but courage. The courage to hope after loss. The courage to love when it would be safer not to. The courage to choose each other every single day." Sophie joined them then, inserting herself between them and taking each of their hands. "This is the best day ever," she announced. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" "The wedding?" Clara laughed. "I think once is enough." "No, not the wedding. Just this. All of us together being happy. Can we do that every day?" Evan looked at Clara over their daughter's head, and in her eyes he saw the same answer he felt in his heart. "Yes," he said, pulling them both close. "We can absolutely do that every day." The months that followed the wedding settled into a rhythm that felt like the life Evan had stopped believing was possible. Clara continued substitute teaching, gradually building toward a full-time position for the following school year. Her health remained stable, scans every 3 months showing either improvement or no change, which in the language of cancer meant everything. There were still hard days, still moments when pain flared or exhaustion hit, or anxiety about the future threatened to overwhelm them. But they'd learned to weather those storms together, to share the burden instead of carrying it alone. Sophie thrived, secure in the knowledge that she had 2 parents who loved her, who showed up for every soccer game and school play, who were building a future instead of just surviving the present. She'd started calling Clara Mom, naturally, without hesitation, and the first time Clara signed a permission slip as Clara Brooks' mother, she'd cried happy tears. On a cool October evening, almost exactly a year after Evan had walked into the wrong hospital room, the family sat together on the porch, their usual spot for important conversations. Sophie was curled between them, reading aloud from a new book, while Evan and Clara listened with half their attention, the other half focused on each other. "You know what I realized today?" Clara said during a pause in Sophie's reading. "A year ago, I thought my life was ending. I was alone, sick, forgotten. I'd given up on everything except maybe surviving long enough to not die completely alone." "That's sad," Sophie said, setting down her book. "I'm glad Dad found you." "Me too, sweetheart. But what I realized is that I wasn't just waiting to die. In some ways, I'd stopped living years before I got sick. I'd isolated myself, convinced myself I didn't need anyone, built walls so high that love couldn't get in." Clara looked at Evan. "You didn't just save me from dying alone. You taught me how to live, really live, with courage and vulnerability and hope." "You did the same for me," Evan said quietly. "I'd been going through the motions for 3 years, too afraid of being hurt again to let myself feel anything. You reminded me that the alternative to risking pain is just emptiness, and that's not living either." "So you both saved each other," Sophie concluded with the straightforward logic of childhood. "That's nice, very romantic. They laughed, and Clara ruffled Sophie's hair. Very romantic indeed. Can I ask something? Sophie said, suddenly serious. Are you going to be okay? Is the cancer really gone? It was the question they'd all been dancing around, the elephant in the room they acknowledged but didn't always address directly. Clara took a moment to answer, choosing her words carefully. I don't know, she said honestly. Cancer is tricky. Sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. Right now I'm healthy and the scans look good, but I can't promise you forever, Sophie. None of us can promise that to anyone. She pulled Sophie closer. What I can promise is that I'm going to fight as hard as I can to be here for as long as possible. That I'm going to take care of myself and go to my appointments and do everything the doctors tell me to. And that whether I have 5 years or 50 years, I'm going to spend every single day loving you and your dad with everything I have. That's good enough for me, Sophie said simply. Besides, my teacher says we should focus on today instead of worrying about tomorrow. Today, you're here and healthy, and my mom. That's what matters. Out of the mouths of babes, Evan thought once again, pulling both his girls close. The year turned, bringing holidays and milestones and the ordinary moments that made up a life. Clara's 1-year cancer-free anniversary came and went with celebration and relief. Sophie turned 10 with a birthday party in their backyard. Clara organizing games and activities with the energy of someone who'd remembered how to be present in joy. Evan got a promotion at work, something he'd been too distracted to pursue during the years of grief, but found himself wanting now that he had a future worth building toward. They took a family vacation to the beach, Clara's first trip outside the hospital home circuit in over a year. Watching her stand in the ocean, letting waves wash over her feet while Sophie splashed nearby, Evan was struck by how far they'd all come. This woman, this vibrant, laughing woman, had once been the hollow-eyed patient in that empty room, and now she was his wife, Sophie's mother, the center of their family. On their first anniversary, Evan took Clara back to the hospital, not as a patient, but as visitors. They stopped by the oncology floor, bringing flowers and cookies for the nurses who'd cared for Clara during her treatment. Sandra hugged Clara so hard she lifted her off the ground. "Look at you," she said, holding Clara at arm's length. "Absolutely glowing. I knew you'd make it. I knew you were a fighter." They walked past room 412, Clara's old room, and found it occupied by another patient. Through the window, Evan could see an elderly man, alone except for the machines, staring at the ceiling with that same hollow emptiness Clara had once worn. "We should visit him," Clara said immediately. "Leave flowers. Let him know someone sees him." So they did, Clara introducing herself to a stranger with kindness and flowers, giving him what Evan had once given her, the knowledge that he wasn't invisible, that someone cared. Walking out of the hospital later, holding hands, Clara turned to Evan with a smile that held both sadness and hope. "We should keep doing that," she said, "visiting patients who don't have anyone, bringing flowers to empty rooms, paying forward what you gave me." "We can do that," Evan agreed. "We can definitely do that." And they did. Every month they'd visit the hospital together, asking nurses about patients who had no visitors, bringing small kindnesses to people facing their battles alone. Sophie often came too, reading to patients or just sitting with them, learning early the lesson her father and Clara had learned the hard way, that showing up mattered, that small acts of kindness could change everything, that nobody should have to face suffering alone. The years unfolded with their mixture of joy and challenge, triumph and fear. Clara had 2 more cancer scares, each one sending them back into the familiar territory of scans and waiting and holding their breath. Each time the results came back clean, and each time they celebrated like they'd been given a gift they'd never take for granted. Sophie grew into a teenager who carried her mother's compassion and her father's steady presence. She volunteered at the hospital, following in Clara's footsteps, and talked about becoming a doctor or a nurse, someone who could help people through their darkest moments. Clara eventually returned to full-time teaching, finding joy in shaping young minds and coming home with stories that made the dinner table come alive with laughter. Evan watched her bloom in this life they'd built, watched her transform from the woman who'd survived cancer to the woman who'd learned to truly live. On the 5th anniversary of walking into the wrong room, Evan woke early to find Clara already awake beside him, watching the sunrise through their bedroom window. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pulling her close. Everything, Clara said softly. 5 years ago today, you walked into my room by mistake and left me flowers. I was so alone I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen, and now look at us, married, raising an incredible daughter, building a life I never dreamed I could have. Best mistake I ever made, Evan said, kissing her temple. It wasn't a mistake, though, was it? Clara turned to face him, her eyes, so different from those hollow eyes of 5 years ago, filled with love and certainty. It felt like a mistake at the time, but now it feels like exactly what was supposed to happen. Like the universe or fate, or whatever you want to call it, knew we needed each other. Maybe, Evan said, or maybe it was just luck and we chose to make something beautiful out of it. Either way, I'm grateful. Clara laid her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. For the wrong door, for your courage to keep coming back, for Sophie's open heart, for all of it. Even for the cancer, in a weird way, because it brought us together. I wish you hadn't had to suffer, though, Evan said fiercely. I wish I could have found you some other way. But you didn't. You found me the way you found me, and that's okay. Maybe we don't get to choose our paths, but we get to choose what we do with them. And Evan, we chose so well. They lay there as the sun rose higher, flooding their room with golden light, and Evan thought about all the choices they'd made. To hope when hope seemed foolish, to love when love seemed risky, to show up when showing up was hard, to build a family from broken pieces and make it whole. Later that morning, the three of them went back to the hospital together, to room 247 first, where it all began, to leave daisies and remember. Then to visit patients who had no visitors, to bring light to dark places, to be for others what Evan had once been for Clara. Standing in the hallway outside an empty room, about to walk in and bring flowers to a stranger, Clara took Evan's hand and Sophie's hand, linking them all together. "Ready?" she asked. "Ready," they said in unison. And together, as a family built from wrong turns and right choices, from courage and kindness and the stubborn refusal to let anyone suffer alone, they walked through the door. Not the wrong door this time, the right one. The one they'd chosen together. The one that led them exactly where they belonged.